I hope you enjoyed this special showing of the Star Wars trilogy. As you may know, the films we've just seen are only the middle 3 chapters in George Lucas's master plan for a 9-part saga.
Whether George only completes 6 of the 9-part series or he actually ever really ultimately completes the 9, it's really 9 parts of one film.
And Star Wars is forever. That's right, Star Wars is forever. George Lucas and 20th Century Fox have plans for 12 more blockbusting chapters to the Star Wars story.
And 9 films. I think of it more as 3 3-act plays.
It was actually designed as 3 films, and it was actually written with the backstory and everything as 6 films. That's why I say there won't be any more after this, because I haven't written any more after this.
George always wanted to make 9. He wanted to make the first 3, then he wanted to make the prequels to that, then he wanted to make the last 3. And that was something that was part of his concept.
No, absolutely, positively, you're really closing the door without any wiggle room whatsoever.
Right. There is no episode 7.
So will there be sequels? Well, I can tell you I've had conversations with George and I've heard lots of rumors, but so far they are only rumors.
To start out, I'm just going to quickly explain what's in this video and how it came to be and how it fits into the larger series of videos here for those of you that have been following along. If you haven't seen the other videos in this series, I'm going to refer back to them rather than repeat everything I already said in those videos. So if it's something from one of those other videos, I might not get into it fully here again, but if you just want to watch a video on this topic, that's your choice too. The third video in this series, or the fourth, if you count the video that I did about the Wills and Lucas's Force mythology, was meant to be about The Force Awakens and the start of the Disney Star Wars era, and that's still basically what this is, but we're just going to take one more step, which I'm about to explain. I wasn't interested in doing just yet another fan video complaining about how The Force Awakens was bad because it wasn't what I personally wanted to see. There's little to no value in that, and anyway, at this point I'd be about 10 years late to that party. The thing is that The Force Awakens isn't bad only because of this or that character decision or plot decision that's disappointing. Those problems with the movie are actually all just symptoms of much larger problems with the entire way that the movie was conceived and the process it went through to get made. It's a fundamental rot at the core of the way modern Disney and the people working on the movie think about art. Their process is antithetical to how the original Star Wars movies, the 6 real Star Wars movies, were made. But in order to talk about how they got the sequel trilogy all wrong, first we need to establish how it actually should have been done in order to make it clear where they went off the rails. So because of that, the first part of the third video in this series was always meant to be an explanation of George Lucas's plans for the third Star Wars trilogy and what it would have looked like if it had been done right. The thing is that when you're talking about Lucas's plans for more Star Wars movies past the first 6, you're talking about plans for what was to be at one point a series of 12 movies, and not only that, but plans that have evolved and changed over 40 years and have several iterations each, so there's a lot to talk about. On top of that, to even begin to enumerate everything that's wrong with The Force Awakens is a huge topic on its own without even going into Lucas's version of all those movies. I tried to write all of this into one script, but it very quickly grew into enough for at least 3 long videos. The video did naturally divide itself into halves though, the first half dealing with the George Lucas sequel trilogy and then the second half dealing with what we got instead. Because the video was too long and because it was already divided into halves, I decided it was better just to post it in 2 parts. So if you were excited for me to rip into Disney Star Wars, that's still happening, and this video is actually the first part of that, but we aren't going to get to most of The Force Awakens specifically until what is now part 4 in this series. This part, though, I think is just as interesting on its own because while most Star Wars fans have heard bits and pieces over the years about Lucas's plans for his sequel trilogy, or even rumors and comments that came out over the years about the plans that he once had for a 12-movie series, I think there's a lot about them that most people don't know, and there's more information out there about them than most people realize. If you take everything that's been revealed about them over the years, which is what this video is going to do, and you put it all together with a little bit of detective work to read between the lines, we actually know a whole lot about Lucas's other 6 Star Wars movies, and a very interesting picture will emerge that's both more detailed and also quite a bit different than the ideas that most fans have about these movies, including myself before I actually started to really research them. When you really look at everything, I think that Lucas's plans are much more interesting than most people realize, and also much less confusing than they're made out to be. Lucas's plans for Star Wars, of course, shifted over the decades he was working on it, but not as much as some fans claim. It's easy to find something that he said in 1978 and then put it next to something he said in 2005 and say that he's lying and contradicting himself, but if you actually look at what he said in detail and look at when he said it and why he said it and understand specifically what he was saying, you'll find that they weren't lies and that there was always a core plan that he had for the movies that he stuck to for the entire time. So to try to understand everything he said in context, the first thing I'm going to do here is go through everything he said on the subject of the 6 other Star Wars movies over the years, arranged chronologically. I'm leaving out a few quotes where he doesn't say anything that he didn't also say in other quotes, but this is basically a complete accounting of everything he's ever said over the years on the subject, up until comments he made after the Disney sale, where he addresses specific things that were in the outlines he sold to Disney, which I'll get to later in this video. There are also other comments out there from other sources, and people like Mark Hamill and Gary Kurtz who have some degree of insider knowledge. But over time, some of what they've said has become confused, and sometimes it's based on misinterpretations. So I'm going to talk about that after, and first we'll just deal with what we know directly from Lucas. Looking at what he said chronologically is interesting and important to understanding it, because that gives you context for the comments and you can see how the plans evolved. Over 4 decades, there are a lot of quotes and there was a lot of work done for a lot of different Star Wars movies. So every time he had to give a quote about plans for future sequels or prequels, he wasn't going to be able to break down every outline and every script treatment and every permutation of every Star Wars project and every version that they all went through during all that time. So he spoke about them very generally, and fans often get confused as to exactly which plan or which movie he was referring to, and they get a lot of mistaken impressions about what he's saying. If you look at it all together, in order and in context, and look at what he actually said, not the fan guesses about what he might have been referring to, we now actually have enough to make sense of the complicated history of his plans for the sequel trilogy. In December of 1975, Lucas was talking to Alan Dean Foster about writing novelizations of his Star Wars stories, and he said this quote, "I want to have Luke kiss the princess in the second book. The second book will be Gone with the Wind in outer space. She likes Luke, but Han is Clark Gable. Well, she may appear to get Luke because in the end I want Han to leave. Han splits at the end of the second book and we learn who Darth Vader is. In the third book, I want the story to be just the soap opera of the Skywalker family, which ends with the destruction of the Empire. Then someday I want to do the backstory of Kenobi as a young man, a story of the Jedi and how the Emperor eventually takes over and turns the whole thing from a republic into an empire and tricks all the Jedi and kills them. The whole battle where Luke's father gets killed. That would be impossible to do, but it's great to dream about." Now, there are several things that are interesting here in this quote. Although Lucas isn't yet mentioning a specific number of movies past the first one, at this point Lucas thought that it was unlikely that he'd ever have money to make a second Star Wars movie, or that if he did, it might have to be a very low budget movie. So he was considering using some of his ideas beyond the first movie in books or in other ways like that. Foster was hired to write what would become Splinter of the Mind's Eye as a follow-up to the first movie. It was a possible route they were looking at if they weren't able to do a second movie, and also as a way to develop ideas for what they could do if they did make a second movie. Space battles were removed from earlier versions of the book, and a planet with lots of fog was added because these things would help keep the budget down if they did use parts of this story for a movie. Now, Foster was also the ghostwriter for the novelization of the first Star Wars movie, with Lucas as the credited writer. So what Lucas said to him at this point is interesting because he was working with him on his early ideas for the Star Wars series. Like I talked about in an earlier video in this series, the first Star Wars novelization opens with a prologue that explains the fall of the Republic and how the Emperor rose to power in a lot of detail that ended up being used almost exactly 20 years later in the prequels. So what Lucas was telling Foster for these books at this point very much reflects the plans he had not just for the first trilogy, but his ideas about all the Star Wars movies. In all of these early comments we have from Lucas, of course you can see that some things changed as his plans evolved over the years, but what's interesting is how many very specific ideas were there right from the very beginning. Describing the second movie as Gone with the Wind in outer space, for example, is very much what they ended up trying to do with the Han and Leia love story, down to posters for Empire Strikes Back specifically being an homage to classic posters for Gone with the Wind. The question about when exactly Lucas decided that Vader would be Luke's father is an involved topic that I'm not going to go into completely here, but I think he was at the very least mulling mulling over the idea earlier than people realize. Just because he didn't tell people about it before it was added to the Empire Strikes Back script doesn't mean that the idea hadn't occurred to him. You can see in this quote here from 1975, 2 years before A New Hope even came out, that he was mulling over the idea of there being a secret to Darth Vader's past and a reveal about how Luke's father got killed. Now, even if he didn't decide until later to combine these 2 points, the general elements that would become the Darth Vader story were there. Likewise, people say that Leia wasn't planned to be Luke's sister, which might be true, but the ideas of twins, or of Luke having a twin, or a character with a secret sibling, or a lot of similar ideas were there from early drafts. We're going to see as we continue on, over time, ideas got moved around or combined based on what happened as the stories developed and as the realities of making films affected things, but I think the surprising thing for most people would be to see how many very specific things Lucas had right from the beginning that would stay there all the way through the prequels and even into his sequel treatments that he eventually sold to Disney. As for Lucas's broad range plans, you can see the core idea right here in 1975, 2 years before the first movie even came out, that the concept for the overall series was the generational soap opera of the Skywalker family, with earlier stories centered around a young Obi-Wan Kenobi and Luke's father, and following the rise and then the fall of the Empire. The prequels would be the rise of the Empire with the Emperor killing the Jedi, and then he says that in the third story, which is what would eventually become Return of the Jedi, the Empire is destroyed. This is an oddly specific description way back in 1975 of exactly what we eventually got when you compare it to the takes from Lucas detractors who claim that he just made up everything as he went along and was lying about having plans. The August 1977 issue of Rolling Stone had an interview with Lucas. Lucas said, THX was about 70% of what I wanted it to be. I don't think you ever get to the point where it's 100%. Graffiti was about 50% of what I wanted it to be, but I realized that the other 50% would have been there if I had just had a little more time and a little more money. Star Wars is about 25% of what I wanted it to be. It's still a really good movie, but it fell short of what I wanted it to be. And everyone said, well, Jesus, George, you wanted the moon for Christ's sakes, or you wanted to land on Pluto and you landed on Mars. I think the sequels will be much, much better. What I want is to direct the last sequel. I could do the first one and the last one and let everyone else do the ones in between. Rolling Stone asks, it wouldn't bother you to have somebody else do the ones in between? Lucas says, no, it would be interesting. I would want to try to get some good directors and see what their interpretation of the theme is. I think it will be interesting. It's like taking a theme in film school, say, okay, everybody do their interpretation of this theme. It's an interesting idea to see how people interpret a genre. It's a fun genre to play with. All the prototype stuff is done now. Nobody has to worry about what a Wookiee is and what it does and how it reacts. Wookiees are there, the people are there, the environment is there, the Empire is there, everything is there, and now people will start building on it. I've put up the concrete slab of the walls, and now everybody can have fun drawing the pictures and putting on the little gargoyles and doing all of the really fun stuff. And it's a competition. I'm hoping if I get friends of mine, they'll want to do a much better film. Like, I'll show George that I can do a film twice that good. And I think they can, but then I want to do the last one so I can do one twice as good as everybody else. Rolling Stone asks, well then theoretically there could be a sequel about the Force, there could be a sequel about the Wookiees, about Han, about Luke. And Lucas says, yes, it was one of the original ideas of doing a sequel that if I put enough people in it and it was designed carefully enough, I can make a sequel about anything. So there are a few things here that are interesting, although he's not yet talking about a specific number of sequels. For one thing, it's kind of off topic for this video, but it's interesting to see here that you can see right after the first movie came out that he's already saying that the first Star Wars movie is only 25% of what he wanted it to be. The topic of the special editions is one that I already covered in another video, so go watch that one if you haven't. But to the point of fans claiming Lucas supposedly changes his mind all the time, I'm just going to keep pointing out how remarkably consistent he is over the course of decades with his comments about a lot of these things. Like the idea that some fans have that he never had plans for the sequels or that he changed everything, some fans also have this idea that the changes that he made to the movies with the special editions were because he changed so much over the years. But you can see right from the minute that the first movie came out, he had the same problems with it and the same specific things that he wanted to fix in it. Another thing he talks about here that eventually played out over the sequels and prequels is the idea of bringing in other directors. This was his plan originally, and of course he tried it on Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, but he's talked more recently about that while it was true he wanted to do this, he realized that in practice it really didn't work.
Even though, like with Empire Strikes Back and some, I ended up having to be on the set the whole time, but it's like I was the only one that really knew what Star Wars was.
I've tried to make movies where I step away, to sort of Empire and Return of the Jedi.
Right.
And after about a couple of weeks, I knew I couldn't do that. I had to stand over the shoulder of the director, help him,
you know, whisper in his ear constantly, no, do this, do that, you know, and be there to help guide it. And it was much harder than if I had just directed it myself.
In the interview from 1977, Lucas said that he thought that he'd set it up so that other directors could step in, but what he eventually realized was that it was more complicated than he thought, and he was much more specific about how these movies should be done. Certain ideas that he thought were implicit in how all of this worked turned out not to be clear at all to other people, and Lucas would have to step in and micromanage things to keep the movies on course. That the movies needed close attention from him to stay consistent would be something that we'd see ultimate proof of when we eventually got Disney versions that didn't have his personal supervision, and we saw just what a disaster it would become without him.
Because there's a lot to it. The Force, nobody understood the Force. Nobody, you know, what they do is, and then they started other ones when I sold the company, and they, you know, a lot of those ideas that were in there sort of got lost. But that's the way it is.
Those more general ideas about Lucas's plans in 1977 are why I wanted to quote that section of the Rolling Stone interview, but as to more specific ideas of what he wanted to do in future movies, it's important to note here also that he already had the plans for doing a prequel involving a young Obi-Wan, and his comments here that he could do a sequel about anything, not necessarily just about the core story of the Skywalker family, will be relevant to other parts of his plans. I'm going to come back to that, but after you put together other things Lucas said about it, you'll see that it wasn't just a pie in the sky fantasy for him. He actually had a few other stories specifically in mind, and those stories are important to understanding what he's talking about when he mentions specific numbers of Star Wars movies that he wants to make. In November of 1977, in one of the first story conference meetings with Leigh Brackett about the Empire Strikes Back script, Lucas spent a lot of time trying to explain his concept of the Force to her, and there are some interesting quotes about that, but he also threw out there that when the Emperor was killed, the current story was over, and then he said that the final episode would show the restoration of the Republic. This story conference information wasn't released publicly at the time, but it was one of the earliest descriptions of plot details that would have been used as a sequel to the original trilogy. In a March 1978 issue of Time magazine, we got our first ever mention of exactly how many sequels and prequels Lucas was planning. The Time magazine article said, Lucas has set up 4 corporations. Star Wars Corporation will make Star Wars 2, which is Empire Strikes Back, and then, count them, 10 other planned sequels. So at this time, 1978, they're saying 12 movies. This same time, early 1978, is when there started to be talk of there being 12 Star Wars movies in a couple other places. A few months later, in May of 1978, the second issue of Bantha Tracks, which was the Star Wars fan magazine at the time, had news about the first Star Wars sequel and how many more sequels there would be. According to Bantha Tracks, the next Star Wars movie was, quote, based on the second of 12 stories in George Lucas's Adventures of Luke Skywalker series. Now, in spite of these 2 reports saying that there would be 12 movies and apparently having information from Lucas or somebody working for him to that effect, the next quote directly from Lucas was in July 1979 when he said, when I did the story for the second film, it was much easier because it's really part of the Star Wars story. The first script was one of 6 original stories I had written in the form of 2 trilogies. After the success of Star Wars, I added another trilogy, so now there are 9 stories. The original 2 trilogies were conceived of as 6 films, of which the first film was number 4. Here he is explaining the whole thing pretty simply, although it might be confusing to people when at other times he said that there was 1 original Star Wars story and now he's saying that there were 6. It's not that complicated though. When he says both of those things, he's talking about the same story, just referring to how it was broken down in different stages of development. In the end, there was always really 1 Star Wars story, the first script that he wrote. He's explained many times that it became way too long and expensive, so he took basically the first act of that first script, moved some things around but left some other things on the table, and made that first part into the first movie. The leftover parts he thought could be 2 more movies, so when he talks about 1 script or about the first trilogy, he's talking about the same thing, about that 1 original story which got split into 3 parts, and he's just referring to it before and after the 1 story was split into 3 movies. To develop this story, at this point he also wrote a fair amount of backstory about the rise of the Empire and the fall of the Jedi, along with ideas about Luke's father and a young Obi-Wan Kenobi and the Clone Wars, and all of that stuff that would eventually become the prequels. So he figured that the backstory that he had could be another trilogy. So when he says Star Wars is 6 stories or 2 trilogies, that's always been what he was talking about from the beginning. There was 1 script being spread over 3 movies, and then there was the backstory for that 1 script, which became 3 more movies. So whether he's talking about 1 movie or 3 movies or 6 movies, he's not contradicting himself. He's talking about different stages of producing this 1 story plus a backstory.
The Star Wars series started out as a movie that ended up being so big that I took each act and cut it into its own movie. But in order to create that movie, I had to create a backstory. And there's this very elaborate backstory that was created in order to get to the point of the first part of Star Wars, the first film.
He says here clearly back in 1979, the story he wrote is one story that he speculated correctly would be told in 6 parts. And then he says that after the first one was successful, he thought of adding another trilogy. So that would have made 9 movies.
Are there 9 in total? Well, there are 9 floating around there somewhere. Now, I'll guarantee that 3 are pretty much organized in my head, and there are a lot of notes on it, but the other 3 are kind of out there somewhere.
But many years later, in the early 2000s, when he thought he wouldn't ever have time to get around to a 3rd trilogy, he started saying that Star Wars was only 6 movies, that it had only ever been 6 movies, and that 6 movies was the whole story. And when he started to say that, fans again called him a liar and said that he was making it all up as he went along, since it's true that at several points he had talked about 9 movies. But here he explained it all clearly, way back in 1979. Star Wars, as he originally conceived it, was one story plus the backstory, and that would take 6 movies to tell. That's the Star Wars story. The sequel trilogy and everything after those first 6 was in addition to that one story that was conceived after the fact. Now that doesn't mean that he didn't have ideas for a sequel trilogy and that he didn't write treatments and outlines for it, and we'll see later on that he did, but when he's talking about 6 movies and 9 movies, he's talking about 2 different things. There's the core story, complete in 6 movies, like he's said since 1978, and like he was saying in 2005 after Revenge of the Sith when he said that there were only 6 Star Wars movies, and then there was the 3rd trilogy, but that was a separate thing conceived later and added after the fact, and although he did work on it, it wasn't originally as developed as the first 6 or part of the first 6, and the first 6, the original project and the original story he wanted to tell, would be the complete Star Wars story without it. In an October of 1979 interview with Alan Arnold, Lucas explained again. Alan Arnold said, "Tell me more about the overall concept of the Star Wars saga." Lucas says there are essentially 9 films in a series of 3 trilogies. The first trilogy is about the young man Kenobi and the early life of Luke's father when Luke was a little boy. This trilogy takes place some 20 years before the second trilogy, which includes Star Wars and Empire. About a year or 2 passes between each story in the trilogy, and about 20 years passes in between the trilogies. The entire saga spans about 55 years. Arnold asks how much of that was written. Lucas says, "I have story treatments on all 9. I also have voluminous notes, histories, and other material I've developed for various purposes. Some of it will be used, some not. Originally, when I wrote Star Wars, it developed into an epic on the scale of War and Peace, so big I couldn't possibly make it into a movie. So I cut it in half, but it was still too big, so I cut each half into 3 parts. I then had material for 6 movies. After the success of Star Wars, I added another trilogy, but stopped there primarily because reality took over. After all, it takes 3 years to prepare and make a Star Wars picture. How many years are left? So I'm still left with 3 trilogies of 9 films. At 2 hours each, that's 18 hours of film." You'll notice that even though some fans, including Mark Hamill at different points, have never let go of the idea that there were originally supposed to be 12 movies, by 1979, Lucas was already backing off of that idea, although he was still mulling over 9. Also notice that when he talked about 12 movies, he never ever said that there were 4 trilogies. He always said 2 trilogies or 3 trilogies if you include the sequel trilogy, and by 1979 he's saying that he didn't want to do more than that because reality took over. Empire Strikes Back was a very difficult production. It was already spiraling out of control by 1979, over budget and over schedule, and he was starting to see clearly that not only did these movies take a long time to make, it wasn't as simple as hiring another director and going on vacation and then coming back when the movie was finished. This is another thing I break down more in one of the earlier videos in this series, but Lucas was much more heavily involved in the writing and production of Empire Strikes Back than people give him credit for. By 1979, he was realizing that, well, it was useful for him to have a director other than himself so that he could be working on other things while that director was on the set. Empire Strikes Back really wasn't turning out to be less work for him than A New Hope had been. Added to the fact that these movies took at least 3 years to produce, 12 movies would mean that he'd be doing that amount of work for the next 36 years of his life, and obviously that idea wasn't appealing to him. So while it's caused much speculation over the years, especially with comments from people like Mark Hamill and Gary Kurtz keeping elements of the 12 movies idea alive, Lucas seems to have realized that 12 was a bad idea almost the minute that the words left his mouth. The other reason that he abandoned the idea of 3 more movies in addition to the possible 9 is that they just simply weren't necessary to the core story. Like I mentioned a minute ago, the last 3 movies were actually never meant to be a 4th trilogy. When Lucas has talked about those other 3 movies beyond the 9, he said that they're more ethereal and tangential than the 3rd trilogy or the 6-episode main story. A little later, I'll explain something I don't think many people know, which is exactly what would have been in those other 3 movies. In 1980, Lucas continued to talk about the 3 trilogies, saying in March to the LA Reader, "Star Wars is really 3 trilogies, 9 films, and it won't be finished probably for another 20 years. In a May 1980 interview, Lucas told Time magazine, "The last 3 episodes involve the rebuilding of the Republic. Only 2 of the main characters will appear in all 9 films, and they're the robots, R2-D2 and 3PO. In effect, the story will be told through their eyes." Now, this is interesting because it's probably the first time he publicly gave any description of the story of the 3rd trilogy, and it matches what he had said privately to Leigh Brackett in their story conference. He says in both places that the 3rd trilogy will involve the rebuilding of the Republic, which is interesting because that means that the Empire would be destroyed by the ending of the 2nd trilogy, or Episode 6. This lines up with what he said to Alan Dean Foster back in 1975, and it contradicts what Gary Kurtz would later say when he was saying that Lucas intended for the Emperor to go through into the 3rd trilogy. Kurtz said this when he was claiming that Lucas changed his plans for Return of the Jedi, and that was one of the reasons that he, Kurtz, left the series. So we're going to come back to that later on when I talk about Gary Kurtz's quotes. The other interesting detail here is Lucas explaining that the droids would be in all the movies and that the story is essentially told through their eyes. This might be the first time Lucas publicly mentioned this concept, but it's important to his overall plans for the whole series. I go more into this in my video about the Wills if you haven't seen that one, but this concept that it's all R2's story and that it's all from R2's point of view and that R2 is the one telling the story, this is something that Lucas has consistently mentioned over the years, but that few people seem to be aware of. It's going to be important in a minute when I talk more about the 12 movie plans that he had at one point. In the spring of 1980, Lucas did another interview with Bantha Tracks, and they asked him about the shift in the plan from 12 films to 9 films. They said, "At one point there were going to be 12 Star Wars films." Lucas answers, "I cut that number down to 9 because the other 3 were tangential to the saga. Star Wars was the 4th story in the saga and was to have been called Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope, but I decided people wouldn't understand the numbering system, so we dropped it. For Empire, though, we're putting back the number and we'll call it Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. After the 3rd film in this trilogy, we'll go back and make the 1st trilogy, which deals with the young Ben Kenobi and the young Darth Vader." Bantha Tracks asks, "What's the 3rd trilogy about?" Lucas says, "It deals with the character that survives Star Wars 3 and his adventures." This is one of the places where Lucas talks about how the other 3 beyond the 9 movies and the 3 trilogies were, quote, tangential to the main saga. Again, he's explaining that there were 3 trilogies and then 3 other movies that were different and tangential to those trilogies. Different how we'll see in a minute. The other interesting thing here is that Lucas says that the 3rd trilogy will deal with the character that survives the movie, which would end up becoming Return of the Jedi. He's careful here to say the character that survives and not pin down which character that is, because as he's explained a few times before, his idea behind introducing the idea in Empire Strikes Back that there was another besides Luke was to raise the tension that they could possibly kill Luke. If Luke was the only hope for the galaxy, that would have taken some of the tension out of Return of the Jedi, because audiences would know he couldn't turn to the dark side or be killed, because that would mean the story couldn't be resolved.
It sets up the fact that in this series, Luke could be expendable at this point. That maybe he's made his bad choice and he's going to go off and something bad is going to happen to him. And therefore, the idea that there is another possibility here, we don't need Luke to tell this story. We can get somebody else to do it. It's really designed to sort of make you feel that Luke is expendable.
That is why your friends are made to suffer.
The problem with one of these kind of movies is like Superman or anything else, but if you got a hero who can't be killed, then where's your drama? Well, here, what I've done is said, well, this guy can be killed. Don't worry, he's not the important one. There is another. It's a cheap trick, but it works.
Introducing the idea that there was a backup hero if Luke got killed made it a real possibility that he could die, and the story could go on into the 3rd trilogy without him. However, we now know that Lucas did intend for Luke to survive. He just wanted for it to not be a foregone conclusion for the audiences so that the story still had some tension. In Return of the Jedi, he also clearly wanted to play with the idea that Luke could turn to the dark side like his father, although that wouldn't really become as apparent until the movies could be watched with the prequels. But since we know now that he intended for Luke to survive into the 3rd trilogy, that means that in 1980, when he said that the 3rd trilogy would be about the character who survives Return of the Jedi, that's an interesting piece of information about the plot of the 3rd trilogy, because it lets us know that he wanted Luke to be a main character and that the 3rd trilogy would be about Luke's adventures. Apologists for the Disney sequel trilogy that we ended up getting have taken certain things we know about Lucas's plans for Luke in the 3rd trilogy to mean that what Abrams and Rian Johnson did with the character was actually following Lucas's plans, and that Lucas wanted Luke to be sidelined important. And while Lucas did want to have a big focus in the third trilogy on the new characters, the idea that he wanted Luke to be out of the picture is not true at all. He certainly did not want Luke to be a bit player that shows up for one scene in episode 7 and that isn't involved in the action at all in episode 8. This is another thing that we'll get to later when we get to the movies that we actually got. But I'm pointing it out here that all the way back in 1980, Lucas made one of his first statements indicating that he did intend for Luke Skywalker to be a main character in the third trilogy. In June of 1980, Lucas did another interview with Rolling Stone for the release of Empire Strikes Back. He states again here that after Empire Strikes Back, there will be 7 more films, and then they ask him another question about the idea that there is another. Rolling Stone says, let's get back to the Empire Strikes Back for a moment. In the movie, Ben says Luke is the last hope, and Yoda says, no, there is another. George Lucas says, yes, there is another, and has been for a long time. You have to remember, we're starting in the middle of this whole story. There are 6 hours worth of events before Star Wars, and in those 6 hours, the other becomes apparent. And after the third film, the other becomes apparent quite a bit. Rolling Stone asks, what will happen to Luke? Lucas says, I can't say. In the next film, everything gets resolved one way or the other. Rolling Stone says, do you have storylines for the 7 Star Wars movies left to be done? Lucas says, yes, 12-page outlines. It's interesting to note here that he says he has 12-page outlines for the remaining films. This becomes contentious later because when he would later decide that he might make only 6 films, he would say that he had much less of a developed plot for the third trilogy than for the prequels. I think this is an example, though, of him talking generally. Does him saying this quote mean that all the outlines that he's written were each exactly 12 pages? Did he for some reason edit them all out to each be the exact number of pages? No, obviously he's talking generally. He's saying that he's got outlines that are roughly 12 pages, that are a handful of pages each. He had more on the prequels than on the sequel trilogy, and when he says that he had outlines for the sequel trilogy, it's true that he did, and when he later says that those outlines were much vaguer and that they weren't part of the story he had originally planned that turned into the first 2 trilogies, that's true also. This is an example of what I'm talking about, where in a quick answer he can't break down every stage of development and every treatment for 9 different movies, so he just says that generally, yeah, he has outlines for each, but then when 25 years later, he says some other details about those outlines that seem to contradict what he said here about the exact number of pages in each outline. Fans call him a liar. He's not lying. He's just not giving an exact page count of every page that he ever wrote for the satisfaction of anal retentive fans, you know? So just chill out about him saying that he had 12 pages for the prequels, 12 pages for the sequels. He didn't mean that all the movies were exactly as developed as one another. In 1980, Lucas did another interview with Preview magazine, and this time gave his most clear explanation about the plan for 12 films, which, combined with one other source that I'm going to show in a minute, allows us to finally figure out the basic structure of what was going to be in all 12 movies when there were 12 movies, and how the extra 3 fit in with the 3 trilogies that would comprise the eventual 9. Preview magazine asked Lucas, do you plan to make any separate films about the characters, like just a film about Han Solo, or perhaps Chewbacca, or the Clone Wars, or the Jedi? Lucas says, I can answer that best by describing the history of the way Star Wars developed. The original screenplay, which was very involved and lengthy, like War and Peace, took me about 8 months to write. Afterward, I said, I can't possibly shoot this movie. It's going to cost $80 million and take 5 years to make. I'll cut it in half and make 2 screenplays. So I did, and I rewrote the second half. When I looked at that screenplay, it was still very long and complicated. Preview asks, how many pages do you recall? Lucas says, a little over 200 pages. It was like a worm. I cut it in half, and both halves got to be as long as the original. Preview says, that's about twice as long as most ordinary screenplays. Lucas says, yes, it is. Most screenplays run about 100 or 110 pages. That was my second screenplay. I decided it was too long. It covered too much material, and what was in the script wasn't really filled out enough. It was too episodic and too fragmented, so I took the screenplay and divided it into 3 stories and rewrote the first one. As I was writing, I came up with some ideas for a film about robots with no humans in it. When I got to working on the Wookiee, I thought of a film that was just about Wookiees, nothing else. So for a time, I had a couple of odd movies with just those characters. Then I had the other films, which were essentially split into 3 parts each, 2 trilogies. When the smoke cleared, I said, this is really great. I'll do another trilogy that takes place after this. So then I had 3 trilogies of 9 films, and then another couple of odd films. Essentially, there were 12 films. Preview says, do you still plan on producing all 12? Lucas says, no, I've eliminated the odd movies because they really don't have anything to do with the Star Wars saga. It gets confusing trying to explain the whole thing, but if I ever do the odd movies about the robots or the Wookiees, it'll just be about them, not necessarily about Chewbacca or 3PO, just about Wookiees and robots. It's the genre that I'm intrigued with, not necessarily the characters. I'm just going to keep it pure. It's a 9-part saga that has a beginning, beginning, a middle, and an end. It progresses over a period of about 50 or 60 years, with about 20 years between trilogies, each trilogy taking about 6 or 7 years. So there's what Lucas said about the other 3 movies there, and then there's the other source I mentioned, which is 2 pages of early notes that Lucas made around the time of the first film that were provided by Making of Star Wars author J.W. Rinsler. These pages show an outline that Lucas made for all 12 episodes, but a lot of it's left blank. Together with the other comments Lucas has made about his plans, though, I think we can actually reasonably fill in all the episodes. What's interesting here is that in this order, when there were still 12 movies, A New Hope isn't episode 4, and the 3 other movies past the 3 trilogies aren't episodes 10 through 12 like most people would assume that they are. The order Lucas has here for his 12-episode plan is in episode 1 that he labels as a prelude, followed by 3 movies that are labeled as being about the Clone Wars, followed by a movie that is labeled as a prologue in the episode 5 slot, and then A New Hope is episode 6. Episodes 6 through 8 are labeled by Lucas as being the Star Wars trilogy. Then he has episodes 9 through 11 with no label, followed by episode 12, which he's labeled as the conclusion. It looks like a mostly blank list at first glance, but there's actually so much information here. First, the fact that A New Hope is episode 6 tells us that this outline was made and had also been rejected before the reissue of A New Hope in 1979 when Lucas had added episode 4 to the opening crawl. This puts this list in the brief period in 1978 when Lucas was still considering 12 movies after the success of A New Hope, but before the difficult production of Empire Strikes Back made him decide to scale it back to 9. So again, consistent with his public comments changing it from 12 to 9 movies. In his comments to Preview Magazine, he talks specifically about 2 of the other movies he had planned besides the main trilogy, saying that one was about Wookiees and the other was about droids. From other sources, we'll later find out that the 3rd odd movie outside of the 3 trilogies was a movie he was considering telling about the origins of the Jedi.
Yes, are you going to, by any chance, put out a movie about the Jedi? You know, at the beginning, so they have something to go by? No.
Since this other movie was about the beginning of the Jedi, it's safe to say that it would have been set in the distant past, and probably filled in a lot of his concepts about the Force and the Sith, which have proven since to be the source of a lot of confusion for audiences and for other people working on Star Wars projects. Lucas would later make several comments about how people didn't understand the Force and had misconceptions about all of those ideas, and also say that he had never got to explain the wills. So that's obviously one area where he had plans and had ideas that never made it into the 6 Star Wars movies that he did actually finish. Lucas also told James Cameron that the 3rd trilogy would have dealt with this more, and he told Paul Duncan in his Star Wars Archives book that it was one thing that he was going to get to in the prequels more, but he scaled back that element because people had such a negative reaction to the whole midi-chlorians thing in The Phantom Menace. So we know from several different comments that these concepts about the Force were an element he'd thought about before and that he wanted to include, but that didn't end up making it into the final movies. Here in his 12-episode plan, we have one episode labeled as a prelude that would have taken place before the trilogy that he labels as being about the Clone Wars, which we can assume is what became the prequel trilogy. Because his movie about the origins of the Jedi would have had to taken place before the prequel trilogy, we can assume that that's the movie he meant to include as the prelude in his 12-film plan before the Clone Wars trilogy. And from the other comments he's made about people not understanding the Force, from that we can get a little bit of an idea of what that movie would have dealt with. So then there are the 3 episodes that he labels as being about the Clone Wars. Those are the prequel trilogy, which he made and which we can watch, so there's no need to speculate there about what those are supposed to be. I think it's interesting, though, that he originally thought that all 3 would happen during the time of the Clone Wars. I think what shifted is that as the story started to focus more on Anakin, he decided that the first one of the trilogy would have to happen earlier when Anakin was younger, so the Clone Wars part got moved more to the 2nd and 3rd parts of the trilogy. Other than that, though, this is still consistently what he's been planning since, 78 when he made this document. After that, Lucas lists episode 5 as being a prologue, which I think we can conclude was the Wookiee movie for a few reasons. Mark Hamill has talked about an idea Lucas talked to him about where A New Hope could have opened with a framing device where a Wookiee mother on Kashyyyk is telling the story of Star Wars to her kids. We know that Lucas wanted to frame the whole story as a fairy tale, as a legend, and as a myth, which would eventually evolve into him opening the movie with A Long Time Ago in a Galaxy Far, Far Away. This was ultimately simpler and less expensive and probably less confusing than opening the movie with the scene of a Wookiee family, but the ideas that he had about the Wookiees stayed with him for quite a while.
The Wookiee actually came from my dog, Indiana, who is a big Malamute, very large, furry dog that looks a lot like the Wookiee, only slightly smaller.
The Wookiees and all the stuff relating to them were personally important to Lucas because it was based on his beloved dog Indiana that would also go on to be the namesake for Indiana Jones, and the idea that would eventually become the basis for Han Solo and Chewbacca, with the image of a man riding around in a spaceship with a dog for a co-pilot, which was based on Lucas's own trips with his dog Indiana in the passenger seat of his car. So it was all very sentimental to him, all the stuff with Chewbacca and the Wookiees, and he kept wanting to work it into the movies as much as possible. I think this is probably also part of why he hates the Star Wars Holiday Special so much, aside from the fact that it's really bad, because his idea for a Wookiee family and a Wookiee movie and all of that ended up partly being used in the Star Wars Holiday Special, and he obviously liked these ideas since he kept trying to find different places to use them, but the special that was eventually made turned out to be awful, and I think it kind of poisoned the whole well and all that stuff for him. But since he was thinking of the Wookiee thing as being a framing device and an opening for A New Hope, I think it makes sense that in his overall plan he would have had it as episode 5 in the 12-film version of the story, and that's why in that case he would label episode 5 as a prologue for A New Hope. The Wookiee movie also couldn't be any place else in this outline because I think the droid movie has to be the last one, which I'll explain when we get there. Next in the outline we have the 3 episodes Lucas labels as the Star Wars Trilogy. One interesting note here goes back to what I was saying before. These 3 episodes, what would become known as the original trilogy, are what Lucas labels here just as Star Wars. Like I said, this is the story that he originally wrote. Whether he talks about it as 1 story or 3 stories or 3 stories plus a backstory or 3 stories with a backstory and then another trilogy after it. This right here, the original trilogy, is the story he started with and the one that it was important to him to complete. There's 1 Star Wars story and then the others are plans to branch off from it and different possible ways to complete it. So that's why here he simply calls these 3 episodes Star Wars. That's his original script. It's his original story. After that, we get 3 more episodes after the trilogy, which he's left blank. I'm going to point out that they're blank because this goes back to the fact that these weren't as developed as any of the rest. Like I've said, he did have ideas of a general direction and several concepts and details, and he did have an outline. But when he'd eventually say that there were only 6 Star Wars movies and that there was no episode 7 and that he didn't have as many concrete plans for the 3rd trilogy, that's also true. He never did. It was a blank spot in the 12-film outline. Then the last one here is labeled as the conclusion. I think this one has to be the droid movie for several reasons, but the main one is what I pointed out earlier, the idea that Lucas has stated over the years that Star Wars is all R2's story and it's all told from R2's point of view. At one point he had the idea of a Wookiee family telling the story and he might have thought of that as an element of his Wookiee movie, but we know his idea for Star Wars being from R2's point of view, whether or not R2 was literally telling the story to somebody when he was still considering the Wookiees telling the story, the idea of it all being from R2's point of view goes back to the script stage for A New Hope.
When I started writing this, I found the most intriguing thing was to take 2 robots and make them into human beings and make them the most interesting characters in terms of the comedy element and the sort of I wanted to make the film around them, use them as a framework for the film. And I knew when I did that I would be getting myself into a lot of trouble.
Lucas has explained many, many times that the reason A New Hope starts out focusing on the droids and spends most of the first half hour on them is that he was inspired by Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress,
or given you clairvoyance enough to find the rebels' hidden fortress,
in which the story involves war and political events with huge implications, but it's told from the point of view of characters with a lowly position in society. This is another thing I get into more in my video about the wills, and I'm trying not to repeat my other videos so much, but the point is that his ideas of point of view and also framing devices and the movies being from the point of view of a droid is something that, again, goes all the way back to Lucas's plans and ideas for the first Star Wars. It goes back to the idea of opening with a long time ago. It goes back to the idea he considered about having a Wookiee tell the story, and it goes back to what he said about it all being from R2's point of view and all being R2's story. He's mentioned it being R2's story or from R2's point of view many times over the years, but in 2003 on the set of Revenge of the Sith, he gave a very interesting quote where he told Rob Coleman specifically that the story of Star Wars is all being told by R2 100 years after the movies, and he's speaking to a keeper of the wills. We know R2 telling the story is the framing device he eventually settled on, even though he considered others. Going back to his idea of telling the story from the point of view of the droids is inspired by Hidden Fortress, this made sense. And the comment about R2 telling it 100 years after the main story places the revelation of R2 being the narrator after the 3rd trilogy at the end of the series. He said that the movie he wanted to do about the droids wouldn't have any of the human characters in it, which also fits with this description because 100 years later, most or all of the human characters probably wouldn't be around. So when Lucas says there's one episode after the third trilogy that he calls a conclusion, I think that's what it has to be. It's his movie that he's talked about doing that was all about droids. And it would explain how R2 came to tell the story of Star Wars to the Keeper of the Wills. And that, I think, would have been the conclusion for the 12-episode plan for Star Wars. Lucas gave another succinct explanation in the Making of Empire Strikes Back book in 1980 about how all this fits together. Lucas said, "The prequel stories exist, where Darth Vader comes from, the whole story about Darth and Ben Kenobi, and it all takes place before Luke is born. The other one, what happens to Luke afterward, is much more ethereal. I have a tiny notebook full of ideas on that. If I'm really ambitious, I could proceed to figure out what would have happened to Luke." There are 6 original stories that were written, really 7. One was an odd film, but 6 original, 2 trilogies, and they were written really during the first one. When I wrote the first script, it was part of those 6 films, and then after the success of the film, I added another 3, another trilogy after those ones. Where before I had one odd story, which really didn't involve a lot of the characters, now I have 3 odd stories. They're very strange kinds of movies, which don't really have anything to do with the saga per se. This quote is noteworthy because, again, when 20 years later he would start saying that there were only 6 Star Wars movies and that the third trilogy was just a vague idea that the media had pounced on, people would point out his early quotes about there being 9 movies or a third trilogy and say that he was lying like always. But here he is again in 1980 saying clearly what I said before and what he said all along, which is that there was one story and a backstory which evolved into 6 parts and that the other trilogy was much more vague and not part of that original story, and that he still needs to figure it out. He's also not lying when he says that he has notes on it. He does have a notebook about it, but as he says here, it's a tiny notebook. It's just general ideas. It's not like with the first 6 movies. He explains again also that the other 3 movies besides the 3 trilogies were odd stories and don't have much to do with the main story, which again lines up with the other 3 movies in his 12-film outline that we've talked about. With his other comments about his plans, we can now figure out that the other 3 movies were the ones that I just described earlier. Before Star Wars, Lucas had been dreaming and scheming of ways to get his strange Flash Gordon homage made, and it seemed impossible. Then the movie was a massive success, and suddenly it was not only possible to develop the rest of his ideas and make sequels and prequels, the audience was actually demanding that he do it. So he very quickly took all the dreams he could think of and plotted a course for many more Star Wars movies. But he almost immediately burned out and came crashing back down to Earth. In July 1982, while working on Return of the Jedi, Lucas did an interview with the New York Times where he said, quote, "I'm not having fun. I smile a lot because if I don't, everyone gets depressed. But I'd rather be at home in bed watching television. I'm only doing this because I started it and now I have to finish it. The next trilogy will be somebody else's vision. No matter how much I think everybody knows everything about Star Wars now, they don't. I've given Richard the answers to 1,000,000 questions over the last year, filled everybody in on everything I could think of, and yet when we get here, the crew comes up with 1,000 questions a day. I'm not exaggerating, that only I can answer. Can these creatures do this or can't they? Or what was the culture behind this artifact and how does it fit in with others we're going to use but haven't seen yet? I'm the only one that knows where we're going and where we've been." In the context of that, Lucas again explained his original intention was to, quote, "do the first one and then be a real mercenary and turn it over to someone like Fox and take a big percentage of the gross. I'd sit back and go to the movies and see them and they were done." But then Lucas says, "When the time came for me to turn it over, I'd fallen in love with it. It's like a marriage. You know what they say about women. You can't live with them and you can't live without them. That's how this movie is. I want these films to have a unity because it's one story. I knew I had to be here to keep the look of it consistent, the art direction consistent, the technology consistent." This again foreshadows what would eventually happen when Disney took over. Lucas had learned on Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi that stepping back didn't work for him because while he originally thought he could hand over the movies to other people and that they'd be able to make more without him, he soon realized that people didn't understand Star Wars as well as he'd assumed they did, and that without him there, the movies quickly went off the rails. He knew he needed to either be involved or deal with the movies not being true to what he had created. So you might ask why he'd sell it all, but as we'll get to later in this video, he never thought that when he sold his company to Disney, he wouldn't be involved in the sequel trilogy. He very much planned to be for the exact reasons that he was explaining here in 1982. He didn't think anybody could make it properly without him, and he didn't want them to. But when he sold to Disney, he also didn't realize that he was about to be forced out. In May of 1983, Lucas did an interview with Time magazine, ostensibly this time to promote Return of the Jedi, which was coming out at the time, but he didn't seem very enthusiastic. In this interview, he said, "The sacrifice I've made for Star Wars may have been greater than I wanted. After Graffiti, Star Wars could have gone in the toilet and it wouldn't have mattered financially. It's an interesting choice I made and now I'm burned out. In fact, I was burned out a couple of years ago and I've been going on momentum ever since. Star Wars has grabbed my life and taken it over against my will. Now I've got to get my life back again before it's too late. Ever since I was in film school in the 60s, I've been on a train. Back then Imagine I was pushing a 147 car train up a very steep slope. Push, push, push. I pushed it all the way up, and when Star Wars came along in 1977, I reached the top. I jumped on board, and then it started going down the other side of the hill. I've had the brakes on ever since. My life since Star Wars has been spent pulling back on all these levers, trying to stop the train from going down this very steep slope with the wheels screaming and screeching all the way. It's been work, work, work. To come back to what these quotes keep illustrating, in spite of fans trying to make Lucas out to be a liar, in a lot of these interviews he's almost bizarrely honest. When A New Hope came out and he was doing interviews to promote this big movie, he was almost immediately saying that he was disappointed in the movie and it was only about 25% of what he wanted. When the time came for him to promote Return of the Jedi, all he could talk about was how tired he was and how sick he was of Star Wars.
I'd like to see more Star Wars movies because I just like all the stories and I'd like to hear a lot more about these different ones. I want to see more of the adventure and I want to see more because it's more fun. I'd like to see more of his creative things like his animals and everything.
I hope they make some ones that start out from the beginning.
I hope they make more Star Wars movies, but I think it's really up to the guy who makes it.
This is the third. Is there going to be another one? What do they say?
I don't think so. Han and I sort of choosing what planet to live on and having a child that grows up with hair like that and so forth. No, I think they were considering doing the prequels, 1, 2, and 3. And I don't know that they're going to do that now. I think Mr. Lucas is very tired.
Yeah. Like you were talking about, probably not going to be another Star Wars, and would you do one if there was going to be another one?
Well, George is very, very tired. He's spoken sort of obliquely about a third trilogy, which won't be till like 2011. And as proud as I am to have a job lined up at the turn of the century, I mean, I can't really relate to it. I, for all, intents and purposes, I just figure, well, that's it.
I'm glad that it brought itself to a natural conclusion. But 3 is enough for me. I was glad to see that costume for the last time.
Still, in the future, machines may have the last word. And those closest to Lucas think we've seen the last of Star Wars, for a while at least.
After this film, George wants to take a break, the first time in 10 years. When you really think about it, I don't know that George wants to do 9 Star Wars films.
Mr. Lucas is very tired.
George is very, very tired.
Lucas might have said he smiled a lot to keep everybody else from getting depressed, but it's obvious that when he was tired and burned out, everybody working on the movie could see it. He's not somebody who can hide how he feels. When somebody else might have been trying to promote the Disney Star Wars movies just to be polite, even if he didn't like them, Lucas instead couldn't stop himself from calling Disney white slavers. I keep coming back to how not only is he not a liar, but he's actually almost honest to a fault, because the issue of fans insisting that he's a liar will turn out to be very important to what would happen with the sequel trilogy when Disney decided to produce their own version of it. If you weren't around Star Wars fans from about 1997 to 2015, you might not really understand just how normal total hatred and disrespect towards George Lucas was among the supposed fans of his work. Fans thought they knew better than him about everything, and anything he said that didn't match what they wanted to hear, they said was him being a shameless liar. You can still find lots of message board threads from these years devoted entirely to the subject of fans listing all the lies that they accused Lucas of telling. Of course, if you read what they're saying, they're stunningly ignorant about the history of Star Wars and about filmmaking in general. I'm showing some of them on the screen here, and you can stop and read them if you want, but it's exhausting to go through these, and so I'm not going to go into more than a couple of examples. But each thing they say is more clueless and incorrect than the last. I do like this one where somebody says that Lucas was lying because they thought he had said that he wrote the first 6 movies back in '75, but on the Phantom Menace DVD you can clearly see him writing the first page of the Attack of the Clones screenplay. This person actually thinks that when Lucas said that he had outlines and ideas for the prequels back in 1975, he meant that he had written completed scripts for all 6 movies. And not only does this person somehow think that that's possible or that that makes sense, he also thinks that if Lucas changes or adds to those scripts at any point in the subsequent decades, that makes him a liar now. I mean, it's just kind of stunning just how dumb these comments are when you read them. But when this person posts this, not only doesn't he hear how dumb he sounds, he actually thinks he's being some kind of clever sleuth and catching George Lucas in an elaborate deception. OriginalTrilogy.com is a website that's devoted to people obsessed with the original theatrical versions of the movies, and you can still find threads on there about what a liar George Lucas is. I like this one where they take Lucas's comments about the original negative of the original trilogy being altered for the special edition and about how it would be expensive to recreate the original theatrical version of it, and they list all the ways that they think that they know from these comments that George Lucas is lying. Of course, if you've watched my video about the special editions, or if you have basic knowledge of film preservation and a decent grasp of Star Wars history, then you know that what Lucas is saying here is actually true. Each thing that these people point out, which they think is proof that he's lying, is dumber and more incorrect than the last. It's kind of stunning how ignorant these kinds of people are about Star Wars history and about filmmaking in general. And yet when Lucas says something that doesn't match with their very obviously wrong conclusions about things, their response is never to try to understand what he said better, but rather to assume that they couldn't possibly be wrong, and so he must be maliciously lying for no reason at all. This is relevant to this video because for decades this type of total irrational hatred and disrespect towards George Lucas was not rare at all among Star Wars fans, and not only was it commonly accepted, it was actually the dominant tone of the discussions about him and about the movies. People who thought this way were by far the loudest kind of Star Wars fans, and so when Disney bought Lucasfilm and was looking to make more Star Wars movies and they tried to listen to the fans, these were the fans that they heard first. So if you want to understand why Lucas was forced out of his own creation in spite of being possibly the most successful filmmaker of all time, these kinds of fans are the first part of that story, even though they were as wrong about everything else as they were about calling him a liar when he actually has a compulsion to tell the truth even when it might cause him problems. So back to the subject of how burned out Lucas was on Star Wars in 1983, and where his plans were for future Star Wars movies at that point. He would go on to explain to Time magazine in 1983 what the schedule of producing these movies entailed, with the article saying, "What producing these movies has meant in practical terms has been long stretches of getting up at 5 a.m., coming home at 8:30 p.m. or later, and no more than 5 hours of sleep. People usually don't understand the implications of what I'm saying," he insists, "but they are awesome. It's one thing to talk about it, it's another to actually live your life that way. After a while, it just gets to be grim. I'm not going to turn around 16 years from now and have my 18-year-old daughter say, 'Hi Dad, where have you been all my life?' So I'm about to jump off the train. I've got this slim chance right now to decide what I want to do." He also talked again specifically about his ideas for the prequels and sequels, only this time being clear that there's a chance he might never make the sequels, or the prequels at this point. The article reported, "The films that record what went on in the beginning, if they are ever made, will be altogether different in look and tone from the existing trilogy," says Lucas. "They will be more melodramatic, showing the political intrigue and Machiavellian plotting that led to the downfall of the once noble Republic. They will have only enough outward action to keep the plot moving. Obi-Wan Kenobi, the elderly Jedi who is played by Alec Guinness in the Star Wars series, and Darth Vader will be seen as young men, while Luke Skywalker may make a brief appearance as a baby in Episode 3. The sequels, the 3 movies that would follow Jedi, are considerably vaguer. Their main theme will be the necessity for moral choices and the wisdom needed to distinguish right from wrong. There was never any doubt in the films already made, in those the lines were sharply drawn, comic book style. Luke, who will then be the age Obi-Wan Kenobi is now, someplace in his 60s, will reappear, and so will his friends, assuming that the creator decides to carry the epic further." Now I'm going to keep pointing out the consistency here of his plans over all these years. Almost 20 years later, when the prequels came out, fans would act shocked and betrayed that they dealt with politics, and fans would act like this was a totally bizarre decision and out of place in Star Wars movies. Setting aside for a moment that of course the original trilogy was all political, and Lucas has talked a million times about how it was inspired by Vietnam, here we also have him saying in 1983 that the prequels specifically would be about politics in the fall of the Republic. As for his comments on the sequel trilogy, here Lucas begins to say, again way back in 1983, that his plans for the sequel trilogy are much vaguer, and that the first 6 are what he had originally planned out, but he does give the general direction that he has, talking about how the theme was about moral choices and telling right from wrong. This is again something that stayed consistent through to the sequel trilogy treatments he would eventually sell to Disney, which he said would deal more with moral ambiguity, whereas in the original trilogy things seemed more clearly black and white. He was interested in the roles of good guys and bad guys getting shifted as the government shifted from the Empire back to the Republic again. Saying that another theme would be wisdom and learning to tell right from wrong is interesting, as he would continue to say that a theme of the third trilogy would be passing on wisdom from one generation to the next, or as Yoda put it in Return of the Jedi, passing on what you've learned. I think this would have been the utility of Luke in the story, where the story would have dealt a lot with the next generation, but also simultaneously with Luke passing on the lessons from the first 6 episodes. The Time magazine article also said, though Lucas has no immediate plans for Han, Leia, or Luke, that doesn't mean he will not come up with some in the next decade or so. If If he does carry the story any further, he will go back to the beginning to make a prequel. Only after that, and certainly not before the 1990s, would he do the sequel and show what happens to the Star Wars trio after Jedi. Again, Lucas is saying that he doesn't have immediate plans for the sequel trilogy, but he does also explain that he has a general idea of the themes and direction. Also in 1983, this time in an interview with Denise Worrell, Lucas said, he has only a vague notion of what will happen in the 3 films of the sequel. In the sequel, Luke would be a 60-year-old Jedi Knight. Han Solo and Leia would be together. The sequel focuses mainly on Luke, and Lucas says Mark Hamill will have first crack at the part if he's old enough. If the first trilogy is social and political and talks about how society evolves, Lucas says, Star Wars is more about personal growth and self-realization, and the third deals with moral and philosophical problems. In Star Wars, there is a very clear line between good and evil. Eventually, you have to face the fact that good and evil aren't that clear-cut, and the real issue is trying to understand the difference. The sequel is about Jedi knighthood, justice, confrontation, and passing on what you have learned. Again, saying here that he has only vague ideas for the third trilogy, but also, again, laying out the general themes and broad structure for it that would remain consistent through to his treatments. This time specifically mentioning the idea of passing on what you've learned, which he foreshadowed with Yoda's directions to Luke in Return of the Jedi about Luke's future. After Return of the Jedi, Lucas was in his burnout period and wanted to spend time raising his family. It's a myth, though, that he wasn't working on anything during this time, because he was actually working on quite a lot with ILM on developing technology that would later allow him to make the prequels, and he was also working on developing and producing a lot of other movies where he wasn't the credited director, even doing things like directing Second Unit on Jurassic Park. But as far as Star Wars news, this was a slow period for the public. In 1987, at a Starlog convention, Lucas said,
Well, there are 9 floating around there somewhere. Now, I'll guarantee that 3 are pretty much organized in my head, and there are a lot of notes on, but the other 3 are kind of out there somewhere.
Yet again, the prequels he has concrete plans for, but the sequel trilogy were only vague ideas. In 1993, Lucas said to Premiere Magazine, a new Star Wars movie will hit theaters before the turn of the century. These will be prequels to the current trilogy. For the third trilogy, I don't know if I will still be alive when it comes time to make them. Here he was already expressing concerns about the reality of what age he would be when it eventually came time to make a third trilogy, which is one of the reasons he would eventually give for deciding to sell his company to Disney. In 1997, to Star Wars Insider magazine, Lucas said, I really don't have any other notion than, gee, it would be interesting to do Luke Skywalker later on. It wouldn't be part of the main story, it would just be a sequel to this thing. Yet another quote where he clearly delineates the main story that he started with the first movie from the sequel trilogy, which would be an addition that wasn't part of the original plan. He's also saying, again here, that a main idea for the sequel trilogy, actually really the driving idea and the only idea, was to continue the story of Luke. Notice he doesn't say here that he'll have Luke turn up for only one scene because he likes mystery boxes more than bothering to do his job and write a story. In January 1999, in the Unauthorized Star Wars Compendium, Lucas said, the first film came out and it was a giant hit, and the sequels became possible. Then people suggested we could do more than 3, so I thought, gee, I can do these backstories too. That's where the Chapter 4 came in. Then everyone said, well, are you going to do sequels to the first 3? But it was an afterthought. I don't have scripts on those stories. The only notion on that was, wouldn't it be fun to get all the actors to come back when they're 60 or 70 years old and make 3 more about them as old people? That's how far that has gone, but the first 6 will definitely get finished. By May 1999, promoting the release of The Phantom Menace, Lucas said to Juice magazine, no, after Star Wars came out, somebody asked me if I was going to do a sequel. And I said, I'm doing the other 2 parts of this one. And they said, you're going to do this trilogy, do you have any more? And I said, I've got a backstory, which I've got laid out. I could probably do that. And they said, but are you going to do a sequel? And I said, I guess maybe I could do a sequel at some point. And that got turned into doing 9 films. Really, it's 6 films. It's really not 9 films. It's extremely unlikely that I will go on to do any more. Now, this is where there's a subtle shift in how he worded his explanations. When The Phantom Menace came out and the prequel plans were becoming a reality, and Lucas also started doing more interviews relating to that.
I'm happy that it's finally finished and that it's now 1 film instead of 6 films. That's what I've been working toward. And the fact that I actually did finish it and the world is still here and I'm still alive is the most gratification that it's completed now.
Also in May 1999, in an interview with Wired magazine, Lucas said, the sequels were never really going to get made anyway, unlike 1, 2, and 3, where the stories have existed for 20 years. The idea of 7, 8, and 9 actually came from people asking me about sequels, and I said, I don't know, maybe someday. Then when the licensing people came and asked, can we do novels, I said, do sequels, because I'll probably never do sequels. In 2001, in an interview with TV Guide, they asked Lucas, what would it take for you to do a third trilogy with episodes 7, 8, and 9? Lucas says, each time I do a trilogy, it's 10 years out of my life. I'll finish episode 3 and I'll be 60. And the next 20 years after that, I want to spend doing something other than Star Wars. If at 80, I'm still lively and having a good time and think I can work hard for another 10 years between 80 and 90, I might consider it, but don't count on it. There's nothing written, and it's not like I'm completing something. I have to start from scratch. The idea of 7, 8, and 9 was more of a media thing than it was me. TV Guide says, do you know how many fans would be willing to feed you cream of wheat and wheel you around in a chair if you did? I think Lucas was kind of annoyed at that stupid comment, and he says, I don't think that's going to happen. Time catches up with you. In 2004, Lucas said to MTV, this was never planned as a 9-episode work. Lucas said, the media pounced when I made an offhand comment. It might be fun to come back when everyone's 80 and do another one of these, but I never had any intention of doing that. Lucas said he only decided to do the backstory trilogy, which Sith, due next May, will cap, because he realized he had already written it in order to tell the story in the first Star Wars films. The original Star Wars was only 3 films, and that was what it was meant to be, he said. After a lot of pondering and thought, I went back to do the backstory, but that pretty much tells the story. Episode 6 is the end. There isn't any more to it. By 2005, when Revenge of the Sith was about to come out, Lucas was being even more emphatic. On 60 Minutes, there was this famous exchange.
What if someone else beside you came to you and said, I want to make episode 7? Could you see that happening?
No.
No, absolutely, positively, you're really closing the door without any wiggle room whatsoever.
Right. There is no episode 7.
In May of 2005, another MTV interview with Lucas said, when the original trilogy was in production, news outlets quoted Lucas as saying he would make 9 Star Wars movies, with 3 taking place after the death of Anakin Skywalker. Well, insisted the man whose plaid shirt and jeans have become as symbolic a costume as a Jedi robe, that was sort of a figment of the press's imagination. Then Lucas says, I sort of played into it, he admitted, but I probably shouldn't have. The joke was, it would be fun to come back when everybody's 70 and make a sequel. But I realized when everybody's 70, I'd also be 70. That idea, now that I'm turning 60, isn't quite so appealing. So if we'll never see it on screen, what does happen to Princess Leia and Han Solo after they fall in love? Lucas answers, Han and Leia probably did get married. They settled down. She became a senator, and they got a nice little house with a white picket fence. Han Solo is out there cooking burgers on the grill. Is that a movie? I don't think so. In 2005, Lucas said to Marcus Hearn for his book The Cinema of George Lucas, somebody once asked me in an interview if I would be making sequels to the original trilogy. I said that it might be fun to come back and do sequels with all the characters in their 80s and ask Mark Hamill to come back when he's 80. What I forgot, or didn't realize at the time, was that I'd be 82, so no, I'm not going to make another Star Wars film at 80.
Right, there is no episode 7.
You'll turn 60 when you complete the episode 3. Do you want the Star Wars trilogy and the mythology to go beyond your lifetime?
No. No, I've worked it out to where when I do it, in terms of the films that I'm doing, this will be the next film, 3 will be the last film, and it'll be a 6-part series, and that'll be the end of it. Not in theatrical films. I just want to keep that special. I don't want to have it just sort of turn into Star Trek.
I always said I wasn't going to do any more, and that's true, because I'm not going to do any more. But that doesn't mean I'm unwilling to turn it over to Kathy to do more. Mm-hmm. I have story treatments of 7, 8, and 9, and a bunch of other movies, and so, I sort of moved that treasure trove of stories and various things to Kathy, and I have complete confidence that she's going to take them and make great movies.
Like I pointed out before, Lucas started attempting to close the door on the sequel trilogy a little more permanently during the prequel era, which makes sense because this is when he was finally completing his original plan for 2 trilogies, and he wanted people to understand that these 6 episodes were the complete story that he had originally set out to tell, and that it wasn't missing a third. Completing that story was his focus, not hypothetical movies that he might do in the future. But I think that the other reason people really focused on these comments as a reversal is that the prequels were also the era, combined with the reception of the special edition, when fans really started to turn on Lucas and interpret everything he said in the least charitable light possible. So this is when people really started to attack what seemed like contradictions in his statements and call him a liar for everything that he said. He was simplifying things when he said that the idea of a 3rd trilogy was all an invention of the media, because he did in fact work on treatments and have some ideas for them, but his general narrative is still basically true. Like he says, when the first movie was a success, people started asking him if there would be more, and he basically said sure, he could do that, and he came up up with some ideas. But as I've shown now, he's said many, many times over the years that the story that he originally came up with was the first 2 trilogies, and that the 3rd trilogy was thought of later and wasn't as planned, and not necessary to the completion of the first 6. What basically happened was that back in the late 70s and early 80s, he was saying, there's a possible 3rd trilogy, but I only have vague plans. And then by the 90s, he was saying that there never really was a 3rd trilogy because he only ever had vague plans. In both cases, he's saying the same thing, but if you just clip a few words from 2 decades apart, sure, it looks like it's a contradiction. It's a bad faith misreading of what he actually said, and a willful decision not to understand what he was talking about. When Lucas says in 1979 that there are 2 trilogies in the story he wrote, but that he could see his way to adding a 3rd, and then in 2005, he's saying that there were only 6 movies in the story that he wrote, he's saying the same thing. In May of 2008, Lucas would tell Total Film magazine, "I've left pretty explicit instructions for there not to be any more features. There will definitely be no episodes 7 through 9. That's because there isn't any story. I mean, I never thought of anything. And now there have been novels about the events after episode 6, which isn't at all what I would have done with it. The Star Wars story is really the tragedy of Darth Vader. That is the story. Once Vader dies, he doesn't come back to life, the Emperor doesn't get cloned, and Luke doesn't get married." I think this quote is a good example of the way Lucas speaks in general terms that people often misunderstand. He says that he has no story and that he never thought of anything, but then in the next breath he's saying that the novels aren't what he would have done, so obviously he has some concept of what he would have done, and he lays out several points about specific ideas he has about what would have happened after Return of the Jedi. So when he says he has no story, he means that he doesn't have a detailed outline like the first 6 episodes, but he obviously still has thoughts about it. Specifically saying that the Emperor doesn't get cloned, of course, is a reference to the Dark Empire comic where they use this device, which is a useful quote because for some reason people who try to claim that the expanded universe is canon point to that story as one Lucas approved of, but just because he let them publish something in the expanded universe, of course, that never meant that he considered it part of his official story or that he would have done the same thing if he was writing it. It doesn't mean he even liked the idea. He considered the expanded universe a separate thing from his movies, so he might have nixed something if he felt it was really a problem, but overall he gave them a lot of latitude to do what they wanted, even if it contradicted his own plans. It wasn't part of the same thing to him, so he didn't mind there being contradictions. Of course, Lucas specifically saying that the Emperor wasn't cloned is one of our first examples of the Disney sequel trilogy specifically doing something that we know Lucas didn't want them to do, in spite of certain Disney apologists later trying to claim that the sequel trilogy did follow his treatments and just developed the story like you would during the development of any movie. We know this is a lie because Lucas has told us himself the movies aren't what he wanted, and I'll show a lot more examples of him saying that later. Also interesting here though is that Lucas points out specifically that in his plans Luke doesn't get married. After the prequels, we know that this goes against Lucas's ideas of the Jedi, so it makes sense, and Lucas has also said more than once that Mara Jade doesn't fit into his ideas for Star Wars. But to the point I was trying to make a minute ago, you can see here that when Lucas says that there isn't any story for the sequel trilogy, that doesn't mean that he has no ideas about it at all and has no opinions on it. It doesn't mean that he was lying about that tiny notebook full of ideas. It just means that he didn't have a full-fledged story arc like he did for the first 2 trilogies. This is why I wanted to show so many of the things he said in this section, because if you go back and look at them, I think it will remove any confusion, even though I know some fans will always insist on still being confused. If you've ever read The Secret History of Star Wars by Michael Kaminsky, it's kind of a monument to this idea that fans know more about Star Wars than George Lucas does. The whole concept of the book is that there's this secondary alternate history of the Star Wars series that Lucas has kept secret for nefarious reasons, mainly to make himself look more talented than he really is. This is how fans justify loving what Lucas made, but also dismissing Lucas as a hack who doesn't know how to make it. They decide that other people must have been responsible for all the good stuff, but since none of the evidence supports this, they also then decide that the real story must be a hidden secret. No matter how clear Lucas is, some fans are obsessed with the idea that he's lying to them, that he never had any plan, that he's making it all up as he goes along, and that what he eventually did with the prequels and the sequel trilogy contradicts what he originally planned to do. In the end, this is really about their own egos and not wanting to let go of the earlier guesses about Star Wars that later turned out to be wrong when we learn more about Lucas's actual plans for the movies.
So loyal to George, and I owe him so much. He at one time said, would you consider playing an Obi-Wan type character handing Excalibur down to the next generation? I said, when would that be? And at the time he said around 2011. I thought, gee, as much as I'd like to have a job lined up at the turn of the century, I was figuring out how old I'd be at that point, and I thought, well, I don't know.
When we're trying to piece together what Lucas's plans were for the sequel trilogy, we also have a handful of other sources besides Lucas who have had some amount of insider knowledge at different points and who have made various public comments about it. Their reliability varies, but based on what we know are the facts as I've outlined now, we can mostly figure out what's true and what isn't. In the 1983 issue of Preview magazine, director of Return of the Jedi Richard Marquand was asked, "Did George tell you the complete Star Wars saga?" Marquand said, "Yes, all 9 parts. If you follow the direction and project into the final trilogy, you realize you're going to meet the supreme intellect, and you think, how is it possible to create a man who has such profound cunning that he can not only control Darth Vader, but the fate of Luke Skywalker, control the destiny of the whole galaxy? You'll be amazed." Now, it seems obvious here that Marquand is talking about Palpatine. I think it's a little confusing that he says you'll find all this out in what he calls the final trilogy, but then seems to be referring to the backstory about Palpatine turning out to be the puppet master behind the scenes, which we learned about in the prequels. So I think he meant this is what we'd learn about Palpatine over the course of all the movies, but not specifically in the sequel trilogy. He knew at this point that Palpatine dies in Return of the Jedi. He had just directed that movie. Because of the confusing phrasing, though, this quote has also been taken to support the idea that Lucas at some point intended Palpatine to survive into the sequel trilogy and be the villain in all 9 movies, which is something that Gary Kurtz would later say. But it doesn't make sense for Marquand to be saying that here, because at this point they'd already made Return of the Jedi, and if at some point during the development it had been the plan for Palpatine to survive, by the time of this interview, that was after that had already been changed. It's possible also that Lucas had told him that there would be a new puppet master in the sequel trilogy, and Lucas would ultimately plan for the sequel trilogy to have a character in that kind of role, but I don't think it makes sense to describe this character as the supreme intellect that Marquand is talking about, who is controlling Vader and all the rest of that, because that's obviously referring to Palpatine. I think Marquand here was obviously talking about what we'd learn about Palpatine's backstory as the future episodes unfolded, meaning the prequels, and he just phrased it in a confusing way, which made it unclear to which of those episodes he was referring.
But he opened up to Los Angeles Times reporter Dale Pollock for a fascinating book called Skywalking, The Life and Films of George Lucas. Pollock got Lucas' cooperation with flattery and threats.
I knew how important film school had been to him, and I felt that Star Wars had inspired countless youngsters to want to be film directors themselves, and that he had a responsibility to that audience to provide them with an effective role model. And secondly, I told him that if I didn't do the book, somebody else would.
Dale Pollock is an author who interviewed Lucas several times and wrote a biography about him called Skywalking, which said, he, Lucas, started anew with the middle story. It had the most action and starred Luke, the character with whom he felt most secure. The first trilogy told the story of young Ben Kenobi and Luke's father and was set 20 years before Star Wars. The final 3 movies feature an adult Luke and the final confrontation between the Rebels and the Empire. The entire saga spans more than 55 years. C-3PO and R2-D2 are the only common element to all the films. Now, the only thing that's really new or different here is that he says the final 3 movies will feature the final confrontation between the Rebels and the Empire. This is a similar issue to Marquand implying the Emperor was going to be in the sequel trilogy, and it's an issue for the same reason. Gary Kurtz and others would claim that the sequel trilogy was originally still going to have the Emperor and the Empire, but that when Lucas made Return of the Jedi, he decided to compress the timelines and move up the death of the Emperor and the defeat of the Empire. As I already showed in several quotes dating back to the early days, though, Lucas has always been consistent that the 3rd episode of the first trilogy, meaning Return of the Jedi, would feature the death of the Emperor and the Empire, and that the 3rd trilogy would be about the rebuilding of the Republic. The 3rd episode, what would become Return of the Jedi, was where the original Star Wars story ended, so obviously Lucas didn't originally plan to leave that unresolved for a 3rd trilogy that he hadn't yet considered making. It's possible that at some time around Empire Strikes Back he considered expanding this and keeping the Emperor around for the 3rd trilogy, but once he got into outlining the stories in more detail, I'm sure he realized it didn't make a lot of sense, because even if he felt confident he would make a 3rd trilogy, he knew that after the original trilogy and before the sequel trilogy, he would direct the prequel trilogy, meaning that it wouldn't make a lot of sense for the original trilogy to end on a cliffhanger when there would be at least a decade before he would make an episode 7, if he ever did make an episode 7. And besides that, there's no evidence in the outlines or scripts that he ever considered doing this, and he's always clearly said the opposite, that the Empire would fall at the end of the 6th episode. So no, I don't think the Emperor or the Empire were ever meant to continue into the sequel trilogy in the form they were in during the original trilogy. What's going on here in this quote is that Dale Pollock was confused or careless with his writing, which he often was. Lucas sat for several interviews with him, but was disappointed with the result. He said publicly that Skywalking was junk. The real reason for the confusion here is that Pollock is an attention whore and kind of a bit of a dope.
He's talked about a trilogy, 3 trilogies, 9 movies all total for Star Wars. He's got 3. He's got 6 left to go. What do you think's going to happen? Will he make them?
Not in the near future. I think basically Lucas is sick to death of Star Wars at this point.
Yeah.
In the final trilogy, which would have Luke Skywalker as an old man, and the repopulation of the universe with Jedi Knights.
You mentioned a point. Do you think he would sell those properties off to somebody else and let somebody else make the Star Wars movies?
He jokes about it in the sense that it would make him look better for the work that he did, but I think he has too much of an emotional investment.
29 years later, one day after the announcement that Lucas was selling Lucasfilm to Disney, Pollock would do another interview and use that occasion to try to get attention for himself once again, claiming that he had read outlines for all 12 episodes, saying it was originally a 12-part saga. The 3 most exciting stories were episodes 7, 8, and 9. They had propulsive action, really interesting new worlds, new characters. I remember thinking, I want to see these 3 movies. The problem with this quote here is that he interviewed Lucas in 1982 and 1983, when Lucas had already abandoned the idea of 12 movies for at least 3 years. So Pollock didn't read the outlines for 12 episodes. If he had read the outlines for all 12 movies from when Lucas was considering making 12, then he would have known that when there were 12 movies, the sequel trilogy he's talking about wasn't episodes 7, 8, and 9 like he says it was. At that point, the sequel trilogy was episodes 9, 10, and 11, as I explained earlier, and as we all know now from Lucas's outline, which I showed earlier in this video. Now, Pollock doesn't know any of this because he didn't read outlines for 12 episodes. He's just full of it. I really doubt he read outlines for 7, 8, and 9, or for anything beyond the 3 that were made at the time either. Lucas might have told him a few general ideas, but why would he show these outlines to this guy when almost nobody else has seen them for 40 years? Pollock gave this quote just when we learned that Disney was going to make a sequel trilogy, and so he was claiming that he had inside knowledge about what was going to be in those movies to get people to pay attention to him. That's all he was doing. He wanted people to think he had insider information, but he doesn't even know as much as you can find out from information that's publicly available. In the same interview, Pollock would also confidently assert that Disney would use Lucas's treatments for the sequels, which he was lying about having read, and he also says that they'll recast Luke Skywalker, claiming that Lucas was dissatisfied with Mark Hamill's performance in the original movies. He didn't know at the time that Lucas had already met with Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher to ask them to come back, and of course, obviously, the idea of recasting Luke is nonsense anyway. But of course, you know, Pollock is the kind of guy who never gets tired of being wrong about everything. He would claim the stories from the sequel trilogy were exciting, but he never revealed any specifics because he didn't know any. So these quotes from him can just be discounted.
In fact, he even joked with me he fantasizes selling the remaining 6 films. And I said, how could you bear to see what somebody would do to them? He said, it would make my work look better.
One other minor source of details about Lucas's plans for the sequel trilogy is Pablo Hidalgo, who has worked at Lucasfilm as part of their story group after the Disney sale, and unlike Pollock, Pablo actually has read the treatments that Lucas sold to Disney. His comments can vary in terms of reliability though, but I'm going to get into them in the next section when I map out what we know about the treatments as they existed at the time of the Disney sale, since that's what Hidalgo's comments specifically pertain to. The first of the last 2 major sources I'm going to go into is Mark Hamill, and Mark Hamill's made several comments over the years about the sequel trilogy and about the plans for 12 episodes.
Explain the, I guess you've been asked this question about 1,000 times, the success of a Star Wars series. Obviously, you're going to be in several other films, right? Several of the series, right?
What it is, it's 3 trilogies, and George just started in the middle trilogy because he felt that was the most accessible story. If I was signed for 3 films, this middle trilogy, and I had the provision that if the first one wasn't successful, they wouldn't make the other 2. But I was committed to the other 2 if they decided to. George felt that if it did misfire, Star Wars would be the one that would stand on its own as having the most of a beginning, a middle, and an end. You know, it has all of those elements that stands on its own. So what he did, he started in the middle. We'll finish the second trilogy and then go back 20 years and tell the story of young Alec Guinness and young Darth Vader.
But no, George, I know, really sort of had that in his head. I think he liked the idea, the continuity of seeing characters that were really young, and Luke was supposed to be 17, 18 in the first one.
Right.
To see that progression to where by the time I did episode 7, I was the exact age that Alec Guinness was.
Some of Hamill's quotes are interesting, but he's also just relying on things that Lucas told him in an offhand way, and sometimes he's misremembering things that he was told 30 years ago, or he's combining comments about things that Lucas said decades apart, and not quite understanding that he's mixing up different versions of different stories. I'm not saying that he's deliberately lying at all, but he's a little bit fuzzy on details, and sometimes he obviously veers off from something that he was specifically told into something that he guessed or surmised based on what he was told, and his guesses and his assumptions aren't always correct. In 1980, Mark Hamill said, "Now George is talking about 3 more films, a 4th trilogy that would have hardly anything to do with space, but would be these esoteric, philosophic, inner-directed films. Can you believe it? George has all this in his head, all figured out. The guy's incredible." From what I went into earlier, you can figure out what Hamill is talking about here, and figure out which part he was told versus which part he's getting confused on and making an incorrect assumption about. When he talks about the films being esoteric and philosophic, you can see where he got there from Lucas's comments that the other 3 films past the 3 trilogies would be weirder and tangential to the main saga, but Mark Hamill's guessing when he says that they'd have nothing to do with space.
George has talked to me marginally about doing something at the turn of the century in the last trilogy, but it wouldn't be on the same plane of existence, if you know what I mean. It's either going to be on another plane of existence or not the same character.
One quote Mark Hamill liked to say a few times was that the later episodes would take place on another plane of existence. Now you can see how he got there from what Lucas said a few times in quotes that I showed earlier about the last 3 films being more ethereal, quote unquote, and more strange and not having to do with the main saga. You can see where Hamill's taking those kinds of comments from Lucas, and he's assuming that Lucas means that they're, to put it in Mark Hamill's words, on another plane of existence. This isn't really true though, since we know that those 3 other films in the 12-film plan would have been fantasy films in space, the same way that the 3 trilogies would have been. Hamill also says that these other 3 films would have been a 4th trilogy, which we know isn't true. But again, you can see how he got there. He knew that there were ideas for 3 trilogies, and then Lucas told him that there might actually be 12 movies instead of 9, so Hamill thought that that meant 4 trilogies. So I mean, you can see what Lucas told him, which isn't really much of anything that Lucas didn't already say publicly, and then you can see where Hamill is guessing and gets some of his guesses wrong. In 1983, around the release of Return of the Jedi, Mark Hamill would do an interview with Maria Shriver.
It's the last one for everyone except for the 2 robots. They're the only ones that go through the whole 3 trilogies, the 9 stories.
I've heard that you've been hired to come back as Luke Skywalker in the last Star Wars film 18 years from now. Is that true?
In like something like 2004 or something.
You're going to be back.
But you see, he's being very cagey because it's either going to be on another plane of existence or not the same character. And I can't really tell you why without sort of getting into sensitive material.
So then this is the last one for you until the year 2004 or around there?
Well, I just like to say, when you see the ending, you'll see why it has to be the last one, period.
Now, Hamill's right that the 2 droids were the characters meant to go through all 3 trilogies, but again, that's something Lucas has also said publicly. I think around the release of Return of the Jedi, when Hamill was asked about being back as Luke for the 3rd trilogy, he would talk about those movies being on another plane of existence, and part of the reason he would talk about those movies being on another plane of existence was that he was trying not to reveal whether Luke survived Return of the Jedi. I think he was trying to leave open the possibility of Luke returning in those movies, but that he might return as a Force ghost, and so returning didn't necessarily mean that he survived Return of the Jedi. Hamill also says that Return of the Jedi has to be the last one, meaning that it will be the resolution of the story in some way, which is true, but he didn't want to guarantee that Luke would be back, even though he probably knew that that would be the plan if they did make a 3rd trilogy. He probably also knew that at this point Lucas was in his burnout phase and talking about there not being any more Star Wars at all, so he didn't want to promise a bunch more in a 3rd trilogy that he thought might not actually happen anymore. You can scan through these quotes for secrets that he had been told by Lucas about the sequel trilogy, but I think he's not actually revealing anything that wasn't already known about the sequel trilogy. I think most of the reason for the confusing way some of it is phrased was just that he was trying to tease Return of the Jedi without giving away too much about Luke's fate. That's why I say with all these quotes you have to look at when they were made to really understand them. Later on in 2004, Hamill would say, he, George Lucas, talked about doing a 7, 8, and 9. You know, when I first did this, it was 4 trilogies, 12 movies, and out in the desert, anytime between setups, lots of free time, and George was talking about this whole thing. I said, why are you starting with 4, 5, and 6? It's the most commercial section in the movie. He said the first trilogy is darker, more serious. And the impression I got, he said, how'd you like to be in episode 9? This is in 1976. When's that going to be? 2011. I defy anyone to add 36 years to their lives and not be stunned. Even an 8-year-old is like, no, I'll never be 47. So I did the math and I figured out how old I'd be. I said, well, what do you want me to do? He said, you'll just be like a cameo. You'll be like Obi-Wan handing the lightsaber down to the next New Hope. So I just went, sure, but I thought he just realized that he's going to be doing it for the rest of his life, and he'd rather not do that. Hamill talks again about there being 4 trilogies here, which, as we've established, was never the case. The interesting bit here is that he says Luke was going to be a cameo handing down the lightsaber, but I think he's talking generally again, saying that he would be in the Obi-Wan type of role and that the main heroes would be a new generation, rather than describing a specific scene of handing over a lightsaber literally. He also would later describe Luke's death in the sequel trilogy and plans about Luke training Leia, so we know that he knew that there was more planned for Luke than just a cameo scene. And we know he was very surprised and unhappy when he read the script for The Force Awakens and discovered that a cameo scene was in fact all he'd be getting in the movie. In the 2004 quote, he's talking very vaguely, almost 30 years after the fact, and combining information he was told at more than one different stage of the movie's evolution. For one thing, if an 8-year-old adds 36 years to his age, he would be 44, not 47, right? So you can see there that Hamill isn't exactly being too specific with his math when he talks about different dates and different episode numbers. In a 2018 interview with IGN, Mark Hamill would say, I happen to know that George didn't kill Luke until the end of episode 9 after he trained Leia, which is another thread that was never played upon in The Last Jedi. Hamill's problems with The Last Jedi are something else we'll get to in the video that deals with The Last Jedi specifically, but this video is going to cover everything we know about Lucas's plans for the sequel trilogy as a whole, and in this quote there are 2 details from Hamill, Luke's death and the fact that Luke trained Leia. There's a minor bit of contention here because Hamill says that Luke didn't die until the ending of episode 9, whereas Pablo Hidalgo has said that in Lucas's treatments, Luke died in 8. Now, Hidalgo's motivation in revealing things like that is usually to defend the work of his employers on the Disney versions of the sequel trilogy, and he likes to selectively drop little details from the Lucas treatments that made it into the final versions of the movies to create the impression that they actually did follow Lucas's plans. We know from Lucas's own statements on the matter that the idea that they followed his plans is a lie, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an odd detail here or there from his treatments that did survive through to the Disney movies, just albeit in a mutilated form. While Hidalgo is selective in what he reveals in order to serve his own purposes, I don't think he makes things up out of whole cloth, because if he was caught lying outright, that could be his job at stake. It would be too controversial. Hamill, on the other hand, as we've seen, already talks generally and mixes up different versions of the stories, so I could believe that he just got this detail slightly wrong and thought that Luke died in 9 when Luke was actually meant to die in 8, or maybe Hamill just misspoke. So if I had to guess, I'd say that in the Lucas treatments, it's more likely that Luke dies in episode 8, but the point here is that we have no reason to doubt Hamill's larger point, which is that in Lucas's version of the sequel trilogy, Luke would be around for at least a couple movies, and that he would train Leia and be actively involved in the story, and that he wouldn't have a death scene until after that had happened. All of which was tossed in the dumpster by J.J. Abrams' imbecilic decision to sideline Luke in The Force Awakens, and Johnson's even more imbecilic decision to leave him on a distant island all throughout episode 8, never having a proper story where he trained Leia or interacted with most of the other characters. The fact that Lucas would have wanted to kill off Luke at some point in the sequel trilogy makes sense. You'd want to give the character a big send-off, probably sacrificing himself in a heroic way or, something along those lines. People bring up the fact that Lucas planned to kill Luke as a defense of what Rian Johnson did in The Last Jedi to say, see, they were just doing what Lucas wanted. But nobody objected to killing Luke, which could have been a great scene. They objected to the horrible way in which killing Luke was handled. But once again, that's something I'll get to when I get to the Last Jedi video.
And what about sequels? The producer of Star Wars, Gary Kurtz.
We had a lot of speculation about sequels to Star Wars, and we are working on story material that will develop into potentially one or more motion pictures.
The last major source of quotes I'll get to about the sequel trilogy here is Gary Kurtz, but this one is problematic for several reasons. Kurtz was the producer of the first 2 Star Wars movies before being fired after Empire Strikes Back because the production of that movie spun wildly out of control and went over budget, which are the kinds of things a producer is supposed to be managing.
And I want you to get out of this office right now.
I'm sorry, Zeb.
No way.
You brought you brought it on yourself.
I don't want you here.
I'm so
Out.
sorry, George. I didn't think it would go like this.
Out.
Ted, I got your voucher.
Out! There.
I'm sorry about that. I'm so sorry. We'll have him, like, burned and... Well,
I don't even know who that guy is.
Independence has its price. Lucas financed Empire Strikes Back, and when the film went over budget, he was broke.
At the time, Lucas suffered immensely from both the humiliation of being broke. This is a man who had made Star Wars, the biggest movie of all time, and he almost couldn't make a payroll one week. And the fact that he had to go back to banks, for whom he has no great love, and virtually beg for the money to complete that movie was a very humiliating experience for him.
Kurtz remained bitter over the years about the way he parted from the series and has given many interviews where he's been dismissive of Lucas and tries to claim that he chose to leave because he didn't like the direction Lucas was taking the movies. The facts don't bear this out, but of course it's catnip to the types of people who don't want to give Lucas credit for anything, so those fans take everything Kurtz has said at face value. Kurtz has several times described what he thought episodes 6 through 9 were originally supposed to be, and claimed that part of the reason he left before they filmed Return of the Jedi was that he was unhappy that these plans were being changed for a story that he thought wasn't as good. This lets him take some cheap shots at Ewoks and the prequels that he knows that Lucas haters will eat up, and of course is a version of events that he likes much more than admitting that he got fired because he sucked at his job. Kurtz wasn't involved in the stories of the movies in a creative capacity even when he was still working on them. He saw scripts and story treatments because he was producing the films and needed to make plans for financial arrangements and practical considerations about filming them, but he wasn't a writer or a story consultant. And although Lucas haters like to say that he must be one of the reasons that they like the first two movies better than Return of the Jedi, Kurtz allowing the production and budget to spin out of control almost tanked the whole series. Kurtz still tries to claim, though, that the reason he left was that the story wasn't meeting his standards. He's complained about there being a second Death Star and things like that, and he's claimed that there were originally different stories planned, both for Return of the Jedi and for the sequel trilogy, that he knows about, but which were abandoned. The problem is that all of his descriptions contradict what we know about the drafts the movies went through and the story conferences that went into writing the scripts. Again, Kurtz wouldn't know much about those because he wasn't at the story conferences. He saw some outlines and drafts after the fact so that he could make plans about filming and the sets and so on. Kurtz went on a bit of a self-promotional press tour during the late 90s and early 2000s when Star Wars was big news because of the prequels, and he started making proclamations about the original plans for the sequel trilogy and what the prequels were originally meant to be before Lucas changed them to what was made, which predictably Kurtz didn't think was good. In 1989, Kurtz said the 9 episodes broke down as follows. Episode 1, he said, was to focus on the origins of the Jedi Knights and how they are initiated and trained. Episode 2, he said, was the introduction and development of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Episode 3 was the introduction and life of Vader. Episode 4, he said, there were 7 different drafts of the film. At one point, they pursued buying the rights to the Hidden Fortress because of the strong similarities. At another point, Luke was a female, Han was Luke's brother, Luke's father was the one in prison at one point, and he said at one point the film featured 40 Wookiees. With Empire Strikes Back, he claims the screenplay of Empire was almost exactly what is seen on screen, and there were only a few cutscenes. We know that they rewrote all kinds of stuff during filming, but that's a whole different topic.
I love you.
I know.
For episode 6, Kurtz claims that Leia was to be elected queen of her people, leaving her isolated. Han was to die. Luke confronted Vader and went on with his life alone. Leia was not to be Luke's sister, he says. For episode 7, he said the third trilogy was to focus on Luke's life as a Jedi, with very few details planned out. Episode 8, he says, is where Luke's sister, who is not Leia, appears from another part of the galaxy. And then episode 9, he claimed, was the first appearance of the Emperor. The problem is here that his descriptions of what the prequels were didn't line up with any version of the prequels that had actually been planned, and what he says about the sequel trilogy doesn't seem any more accurate either. He claimed that the first prequel was originally supposed to show the origins of the Jedi Order and the destruction of the Sith, which means that it would have taken place thousands of years before the first Star Wars, and he seemed to think that Anakin wouldn't show up until the third prequel. What he was actually talking about was a short period after the first film in 77 and the beginning of 78 when Lucas was talking about 12 possible Star Wars movies now that the first one was a success. And a movie about the origin of the Jedi was one of the stories that he tossed out there. It was never suggested as one of the episodes of the prequel trilogy, though, and while Kurtz in his version lists the prequels as episode 1 through 3, in the 12-episode plan we know that they would have been episodes 2 through 4 and followed the movie about the origin of the Jedi. Kurtz is severely confused about what the actual plans were. He just knows that a story about the origins of the Jedi was one of the story ideas that he had heard, so he assumed that that must have been the first prequel and was somehow surprised that that wasn't wasn't what the prequels were actually about. Like I've said, he wasn't involved in the creation of the stories, and he certainly wasn't privy to Lucas's personal thoughts. In 2002, Kurtz would go on to say, well, a lot of the prequel ideas were very, very vague. It's really difficult to say. I can't remember much about that at all, except dealing with the Clone Wars and the formation of the Jedi Knights in the first place. That was supposed to be one of the keys of episode 1, was going to be how the Jedi Knights came to be. He admits here that what he read was vague and that almost 30 years later, he can't remember much of it, yet he still asserts that the first episode was supposed to explain the formation of the Jedi. If he'd stop and think about it for a second, he'd know that that makes no sense. He knows that the trilogy was supposed to involve Anakin and Obi-Wan, so unless he thinks that the Jedi only existed for 20 years in A New Hope, when Obi-Wan says that they've existed for 1,000 generations, then he would know that he's off by a few millennia in his outline. Another thing Lucas was always clear and consistent on was his idea that the trilogies would be about 20 years or one generation apart from each other, and Kurtz should be able to figure out that Luke wasn't born when his father was 2,000 years old. All Kurtz really says in his descriptions of episodes 2 and 3 is that they would have dealt with Vader and Obi-Wan, which isn't news to anybody and is what Lucas would eventually do and what he always said that he would do. What Kurtz says about episode 4 isn't really news either, because most of the drafts of the movie have been publicly available in some form and have been endlessly analyzed, although he does manage to confuse almost all of the specifics that he mentions. With Return of the Jedi is where he starts to make bold claims because of his fictional story that he left and not got fired, and that the supposed reason he left is because Lucas was ruining the original plans for the Return of the Jedi story and the stories that followed. In 2000, Kurtz would say, the one story thread that got totally tossed out the window, which was really pretty important, I think, was the one of Vader trying to convince Luke to join him to overthrow the Emperor. That together they had enough power that they could do that, and it wasn't him saying, I want to take over the world and be the evil leader. It was that transition. It was Vader saying, I'm looking again at what I've done and where my life has gone and who I've served, and very much in the samurai tradition, I don't know what that means in this case, and saying if I can join forces with my son, who is just as strong as I am, that maybe we can make some amends. So there was all of that going on in Jedi as well. That was supposed to go on. So the story was quite a bit more poignant, and the ending was the coronation of Leia as the queen of what was left of her people to take over the royal symbol. That meant she was then isolated from all of the rest, and Luke went off then by himself. It was basically a kind of bittersweet ending. She's not his sister that dropped in to wrap everything up neatly. His sister was someone else way over on the other side of the galaxy, and she wasn't going to show up until the next episode. Okay, and then in 2002, Kurtz would say, one of the reasons Jedi came out the way it did was because the story outline of how Jedi was going to be seemed to get tossed out. And one of the reasons I was really unhappy was the fact that all of the carefully constructed story structure of the characters and things that we did in Empire was going to carry over to Jedi.
It was slightly more bittersweet than what happened. Han Solo was going to be killed in a raid. Princess Leia would have to decide in the story to take over the mantle of the leader of her people, or what was left of her people, and therefore go off on her own, really, and or was leaving Luke on his own, I suppose is the best way to put it.
That old man is mad.
Okay, so here he still seems to think that he was constructing the story, which never happened, and he's again claiming to be very upset that the story was thrown out, even though he can barely remember what it was. It's a bad misreading of Empire Strikes Back to think that Vader wanted Luke to help him overthrow the Emperor so that they could free the galaxy and become good guys. Vader says right there in the scene with Luke that he wants to overthrow the Emperor so that they can rule the galaxy and be the new dictators. It's about Vader wanting more power, obviously, not about Vader suddenly regretting his decisions and wanting to be a good guy now. Vader, at that point, he still thinks that he was on the right path all this time. He just thinks that he didn't have enough power.
If you only knew the power of the dark side.
Kurtz tosses out the idea that Han was supposed to die, which obviously was considered, but the reason it was considered was because Harrison Ford might have decided not to do the third movie, and if he did do it, he might have only done it on the condition of Han being killed. It's very, very old news that Ford always wanted Han to get killed off because he thought the character had served his purpose and he wanted a resolution to the story. That is, he wanted a resolution to the story until Disney paid him $5 million to show up for The Rise of Skywalker and stand there for 5 minutes because they had ruined the rest of the legacy characters and didn't have anything else to fill their stupid movie with.
I think it's quite clear that I've got nothing better to do.
but we're not going to get into the Rise of Skywalker until about 3 more videos from now. The point for this one is that, yeah, they considered Han being killed in Return of the Jedi, but it was mostly because of Harrison Ford's uncertainty about doing more of the movies, not because it was some sacred story point that was important to Lucas's vision. Lucas always wanted Ford back for more, but he built in other possibilities in case that wasn't going to happen.
We made Star Wars with the idea that it was a one-off, a single film, and it was only after it was released and we had all these interviews where there was hints that I have to admit both George and I said, well, there was probably enough story material to do 3 films, maybe more. It's evident if you look carefully at Star Wars and then at Empire that there was no clue in Star Wars about Luke's father being Darth Vader.
Kurtz always seems to feel totally comfortable speaking on Lucas's behalf about what Lucas's inner thoughts were and what his plans were for the story at points when Kurtz couldn't possibly have known any of that. He just confidently will say that when they made the first movie, there was never any plan whatsoever for anything beyond one movie, and we know that that isn't true. There's all kinds of documentation of all the things that Lucas wrote before the first movie ever came out that didn't make it into the first script. From Kurtz's perspective as a producer, yeah, he was only working on one movie at the time, but Lucas was already working with Alan Dean Foster on things like Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which was expressly intended as being a template for a possible sequel to the first movie, and he was writing with Foster a backstory which would appear in the A New Hope novelization explaining the fall of the Republic, exactly as it would eventually be shown in the prequels. This was all stuff Lucas had done before the first movie was ever even released, and before they knew if it would be enough of a success to make sequels, but in spite of that, he was already working on ways to expand the story and use the other material he'd written, even if they couldn't afford to make another movie out of that material. And when the movie was a success, within just a couple months, Lucas was already having story conference meetings with Leigh Brackett, laying out in great detail plans that he had for sequels, including many things that had been in his early drafts and his other writing for the first movie that he had already written years before this. So Kurtz can say that he was only hired to produce one movie to start out and that they sold it as a single movie and not as a series, but just because that's all he was involved in, that doesn't mean that it's all Lucas was working on, and to say that Lucas wasn't working on anything else is either a lie or total ignorance.
The original outline for Jedi was one where Luke does actually have a twin sister, but she was, as Yoda mentions, the other. It's somebody else way off on the edges of the galaxy, and someone who wouldn't come into play in the stories until much later. So, and there were a lot of other things that were different from the way Jedi actually turned out.
Kurtz says a lot of things about how Leia wasn't meant to be Luke's twin, and how there wasn't meant to be a Death Star in Return of the Jedi, and how the Emperor wasn't meant to die yet, but he doesn't actually know any of that. Just because it wasn't in a draft of the screenplay that he read before he was fired, doesn't mean that Lucas hadn't thought of it. The comments Kurtz has made about all of this have gained a lot of traction and been treated as facts because they conform to what fans like to think about Lucas, and especially what they like to think during the height of the prequel backlash years, which is mainly when Kurtz was going around saying this stuff. Fans assume that because something wasn't yet there in a particular draft of the screenplay, that means that Lucas hadn't thought of it yet. That's a guess, not a fact. Kurtz says himself that Luke was supposed to have a sister, and whether he knows it or not, the idea of twins and all of that was there from the very early drafts of the first movie. When Lucas decided that Leia was supposed to be the sister is up for debate because we can't read his mind, but whenever he settled on that, it was an evolution of ideas that had been there since the beginning. Between tellings of his version, Kurtz also changes whether the sister was introduced in episode 7 or episode 8, in spite of claiming that he's giving out specific details about each episode. But either way, if it's 7 or 8, the idea that Luke's sister wouldn't be introduced until the third trilogy doesn't really make any sense, because whether the sister was Leia or not, the idea of introducing a sister was that she was presumably meant to be the other that Yoda spoke of, right? And the purpose of introducing the idea of the other was to suggest that Luke could be killed off in Return of the Jedi because there would be another character to replace him. So introducing the other after Return of the Jedi, that would remove the entire purpose of the whole concept of having that character in the series. Kurtz's whole other idea here seems to be that 4 through 9 were really kind of a hexology and one long story, with the third trilogy continuing very shortly after the original trilogy. This doesn't align with what Lucas has said about it, though, or what we know about it, which has always been that there was a generation between the trilogies, and it doesn't make any sense from a practical perspective when the prequel trilogy would have come in between the first two trilogies. When Lucas was considering 9 movies, he might have thought about about moving some elements of his original outline back into the third trilogy, but he's always said that the sequel trilogy would take place after the destruction of the Empire, which was the end of his original story. It would have been deeply unsatisfying to have had nothing in the first trilogy resolved at the end of Return of the Jedi and have it all just left for another trilogy when Luke was an old man and the next generation had to deal with it, with the audience waiting 10 or 15 years in between without any kind of resolution to the story that had been started. Even if Lucas was set on making the sequel trilogy, which he wasn't, Return of the Jedi always had to provide some sort of closure to the major storylines, both because there would be a gap of a generation in the story before the next trilogy, and also because in real life there would be a gap of at least 10 years before they would even start making episodes 7 through 9 if they did make them. So it makes no sense to think he would throw out the idea of the other and then just not mention it again for well over a decade, or that he would tease the idea of the Emperor and have him never show up until episode 9, which would be, 20-something years after Empire Strikes Back. So when Kurtz talks about the Emperor not being revealed until the end of episode 9, it not only goes against everything Lucas has said about the movies and everything that was in his original story when it was 2 trilogies before he decided to add a 3rd trilogy, it just doesn't make any sense on a storytelling or a practical level. I think what we have here are Kurtz's own personal thoughts about what he would have liked to have seen, but which nobody else in the production was interested in, which might be part of why he's always been so butthurt about the whole thing, combined with vague memories and his misinterpretation of Lucas's plans, which he never understood that well in the first place. One thing here which he seems to really miss is this idea that he had about Leia ending up becoming queen of her people and sort of isolated, and Luke ending up off on his own. But the reason I'm talking about his quotes here at all is because if you can figure out all the parts he got wrong and then you kind of squint, you can make out the real information that he probably saw before he mixed everything up in his version of it. We know now that Leia becoming a leader and Luke ending up off on his own actually is sort of what Lucas had planned for them in the sequel trilogy, just not in the particular ways that Kurtz misunderstood it. I don't know how Kurtz thought that Leia would be queen of the people of Alderaan, which is what he seems to imply, given that those people were all blown up 2 movies prior. But we do know that in Lucas's treatment, she'd end up leading the Republic that's being rebuilt after the destruction of the Empire. This actually makes sense, since as a former senator and leader of the rebellion, Leia would be a natural choice to lead the new version of the Republic, right? And she'd be involved in the story, since Lucas has said that rebuilding the Republic would be the major storyline of the sequel trilogy. The idea of Leia becoming queen in Kurtz's version of events doesn't really make any sense, since he thought the Empire would still be around. So then what is Leia queen of? She's not queen of Alderaan, because Alderaan is gone, like I said. Is she queen of the rebels? I mean, she was already leading the rebels. It's not really a promotion. Kurtz is just mixing up the timeline here and misremembering ideas that he heard and that he only half understood to begin with. He's bemoaning that Leia didn't become queen in the storyline like he liked, but I think after a fashion that actually is what happened in the sequel trilogy plan that Lucas had, where Leia was supposed to become queen or supreme chancellor or whatever title they would give the position when she was running the New Republic. So in that case, Kurtz was mourning a storyline that actually wasn't abandoned. It just didn't happen in the episode where he thought it did, because he was a confused individual in many ways.
You will find that it is you who are mistaken about a great many things.
So now I think we've established that Lucas did have treatments for the sequel trilogy and how his plans to make them shifted over the years, but in the years before the Disney sale, he only ever gave a few specifics about what was actually in these plans. I think I've also established that although the 3rd trilogy wasn't part of his original plan and he didn't have as detailed of a plan for it as he did for the prequels, that doesn't mean that he didn't have any plans at all, and we know that he in fact did. We also know that in addition to the general plans he had from the 70s through the 90s, by the time he sold his company to Disney, Lucas had started actively developing his version of the sequel trilogy and had created more detailed treatments that he later sold to Disney also. So the big question becomes, what do we know about what was in those treatments? It turns out if you put everything together that Lucas has said, along with everything else that's been released or leaked or revealed in some other way, when we put it all together, we actually know quite a lot. I'm going to start with the most detailed description of the stories that we have, which was given by Lucas in Paul Duncan's Star Wars Archives book, which came out in 2020. First, Lucas says, I thought I was going to have a little bit more to say about the next 3 because I'd already started them, but they decided they wanted to do something else. Things don't always work out the way you want it. Life is like that. Paul Duncan asks, did you have a different idea of what the stormtroopers are talking about were? George Lucas says, yeah, they started out as clones, but once all the clones were killed, the Empire picked up recruits like militia. They fought, but they weren't very good at what they did. did. Paul Duncan says, so that's why they kept missing. Lucas agrees, that's why they kept missing. But then after the Rebels won, there were no more stormtroopers in my version of the third trilogy. I had planned for the first trilogy to be about the father, the second trilogy to be about the son, and the third trilogy to be about the daughter and the grandchildren. Episodes 7, 8, and 9 would take ideas from what happened after the Iraq War. Okay, you fought the war, you killed everybody, now what are you going to do? Rebuilding afterwards is harder than starting a rebellion or fighting the war. When you win the war and you disband the opposing army, what do? The stormtroopers would be like Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist fighters that joined ISIS and kept on fighting. The stormtroopers refuse to give up when the Republic wins. They want to be stormtroopers forever, so they go to a far corner of the galaxy, start their own country and their own rebellion. There's a power vacuum, so gangsters like the Hutts are taking advantage of the situation, and there's chaos. The key person is Darth Maul, who had been resurrected in the Clone Wars cartoons. He brings all the gangs together. Paul Duncan asks, was Darth Maul the main villain? George Lucas says, yeah, but he's very old, and we have two versions of him. One is with a set of cybernetic legs like a spider, and then later on he has metal legs and he was a little bit bigger, more of a superhero. We did all this in the animated series. He was in a bunch of episodes. Darth Maul trained a girl, Darth Talon, who was in the comic books as his apprentice. She was the new Darth Vader, and most of the action was with her. So these were the two main villains of the trilogy. Maul eventually becomes the godfather of crime in the universe because as the Empire falls, he takes over. The movies are about how Leia, who else is going to be the leader, is trying to build the Republic. They still have the apparatus of the Republic, but they have to get it under control from the gangsters. That was the main story. It starts out a few years after Return of the Jedi, and we establish pretty quickly that there's this underworld. There are these offshoot stormtroopers who started their own planets, and that Luke is trying to restart the Jedi. He puts the word out, so out of 100,000 Jedi, maybe 50 or 100 are left. The Jedi have to grow again from scratch, so Luke has to find 2- and 3-year-olds and train them. It'll be 20 years before you have a new generation of Jedi. By the end of the trilogy, Luke would have rebuilt much of the Jedi, and we would have the renewal of the New Republic with Leia, Senator Organa, becoming the Supreme Chancellor in charge of everything. So she ended up being the chosen one. So there's a lot to unpack here, obviously. But I think the biggest single thing that was revealed here was that Maul and Talon were supposed to be the main villains. Abandoning this would be a major factor in how the movie that was eventually released turned out, which is a topic that will be in the next video now. But for now, I'm going to talk about what Lucas had planned before we get into how and why J.J. Abrams dismantled it. While it was a new reveal to this interview that the puppet master character pulling the strings with the bad guys would be Darth Maul, we already knew that Lucas emphatically didn't want this role to be filled by Palpatine in the third trilogy, which is of course what Abrams would eventually do. We already had the quote from Lucas that I mentioned earlier, where he specifically said that the Emperor did not clone himself in his version of the sequel trilogy. And we also have a quote from Ian McDiarmid, who said that Lucas told him specifically that the Emperor was definitely dead after Return of the Jedi. McDiarmid said, I remember saying, is he dead, George? At the time, and he said, yes, he is, absolutely dead, McDiarmid said. If there was anybody that Lucas would have told if he thought that the Emperor would come back, it would have been McDiarmid, given that he would need McDiarmid to play the part. The second biggest topic here in what Lucas is saying is that Lucas is explaining that he wanted the third trilogy to focus on Leia and Vader's grandchildren. Notice that he says grandchildren, plural, as he has consistently said in several places after the Disney sale when he's talked about his plans for the third trilogy.
What happened to Darth Vader's grandchildren? Well, I'm curious about what happened to Darth Vader's grandkids. What happened to Darth Vader's grandchildren? The original saga was about the father, the children, and the grandchildren.
Another source of a surprising amount of information about Lucas's treatments are the Art of books that were released for The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. But that's where a little bit of the detective work comes in. Disney is in the business of lying about the productions of these movies because they want to make it seem as though they had some brilliant plan and the productions weren't actually the clusterfucks that they ultimately became. So there are certain things that the Art of books can't say, can't touch. J.W. Rensler, who wrote the best books on the making of the original trilogy and Revenge of the Sith, also completed a book on the production of The Force Awakens, but Disney decided to cancel the book and also made him stop when he started a blog talking about his experiences behind the scenes at Lucasfilm during the production of The Force Awakens. So usually they want to avoid talking about anything touchy with these movies, especially the truth about Lucas's involvement or lack thereof. But in the Art of the Last Jedi book, because it serves their purposes in this particular case, they reveal that certain concept art for the sequel trilogy was in fact directly approved by George Lucas himself. himself. The concept art pieces that they reveal he approved of are a drawing of Luke and a concept for Luke's Jedi Temple. Saying that Lucas approved these concepts serves their purpose here because a version of these ideas would eventually make it into the finished movies. So saying that Lucas approved concept art for these things seems to indicate that they had Lucas's approval for what they would eventually do with Luke in the final movie. This is a lie, of course, as Lucas has specifically said many times that the story that we saw was not his story. While they kept certain points from his story, how they handled those points fundamentally changed their meaning. What it does reveal, though, is interesting because it allows us to figure out some important dates in the timeline of The Force Awakens production. The sale of Lucasfilm to Disney was finalized and announced on October 30th, 2012. On November 9th, 2012, Michael Arndt is announced to be writing Episode 7, although it would become clear that he had been working with Lucas on the stories for some time prior to the Disney sale. On December 11th and December 12th, 2012, there were meetings in San Francisco and Skywalker Ranch to select people for the movie's art department. Kathleen Kennedy doesn't meet with J.J. Abrams to discuss directing until well after this on December 14th. And at first, Abrams was reluctant and they wouldn't reach a deal with him for a while. So at this point, they're having art department meetings, but he's not involved. He has nothing to do with what's happening with the art department yet. At Christmas time, 2012, the newly formed art department starts meeting, along with Michael Arndt, up at Big Rock Ranch, which was a facility adjacent to Skywalker Ranch that Lucas also ran. Now, the key thing here is that this group had Lucas's story treatments and that they were working with Arndt, who had already been working with Lucas on the story for some time. So we know that the starting point for their work here was from Lucas's concepts for the movies, and J.J. Abrams still wasn't involved yet. At these meetings around Christmas, they were said to be breaking down the general structure of the entire trilogy and looking at what they would need to design first. On January 9th, 2013, they have the first official meeting of the art department with Doug Chiang, who had done a lot of design work on the prequels and been handpicked by Lucas to lead the art department on The Phantom Menace, and he would start doing designs for the older Luke. On January 16th, 2013, the art department has their next meeting with a week's worth of concept art now that they'd been developing from the Lucas treatments that they'd discussed in the earlier meetings. We know that Lucas personally attended this meeting on January 16th and that they presented him with images of Luke, Luke's Jedi Temple, and Luke training Kira, Kira being the name of the movie's female protagonist at the time. It's from this meeting that we know about the two concepts Lucas approved of old Luke and Luke's Jedi Temple. On January 24th, after a meeting with Lucas and getting his feedback and approval of some of the designs, Rick Carter and Doug Chiang, who were leading the art department at the time, had a meeting with Bob Iger and other Disney executives at Big Rock Ranch, where they gave a concept art presentation for the movie, showing them the look they were developing, again, presumably at this point all based on work that was from Lucas's treatments and which Lucas had approved. It's important to understand that they still at this point hadn't met with Abrams, but they had run their work past Lucas, so we can assume to an extent that what they were showing here to Bob Iger and the Disney executives is a picture of Lucas's ideas for the movie, as much as they had been developed at that point. It isn't until the day after this meeting on January 25th that J.J. Abrams agrees to direct the movie and they announce that news. Then, one of the first things that Abrams does is move the art department meetings and the production of the movie from Big Rock Ranch and Skywalker Ranch down to his Bad Robot headquarters in LA so that what they were doing would be out of Lucas's view. This creates a pretty clear demarcation between when Lucas was still involved and when he was very suddenly cut out of the picture. We do have a period of about a month and a half or almost 2 months where the art department was working from Lucas's treatments and with Lucas's chosen writer to develop concept art for the movie based on his ideas. And during this time, not only were they working from Lucas's story, he was meeting with them to personally approve the art and give feedback on it. So for about 2 whole months here, Lucas was still basically directing the movie. And during that time, they actually painted quite a lot of concept art. The Art of the Force Awakens book doesn't make it clear when Lucas was involved and when they cut him out, but it does present the art created for the film in the chronological order of when it was done. So if you know the timeline of when Lucas was involved, suddenly you can see which paintings were from Lucas's ideas and which paintings were done after the production was moved away from Lucas's supervision. In the book, to obfuscate what paintings were done specifically from Lucas's treatments and at what point they veered off, they describe those first 2 months as being sort of like brainstorming, where they were encouraged to just come up with anything they wanted out of the blue and just try things out, as if all the art from this period is just kind of random things that the artists made up on their own. But with what we now know about Lucas's story treatment, treatments, you can see that that's not true at all. All this time, the artists were painting very specific scenes and concepts straight out of Lucas's treatments, even getting into detailed storyboards of specific sequences and things like that. And there were obviously certain locations and plot points that they were told to develop because there were particular specific locations and characters and events that they kept working on and coming back to in many different versions during those months. When the book eventually came out, for example, there was a painting of Darth Talon in there with some shadowy figure behind her and a few different concepts for this shadowy figure wearing different masks so that you couldn't see his face. And from how the book was written, you might assume that this was just somebody's random idea for a possible bad guy and that they just used Darth Talon because they'd seen her in one of the comic books. Now that Lucas has explained a bit more about his story, though, we know that they were illustrating a specific idea from his treatment where he wanted Darth Talon specifically to be the primary antagonist of his story, and that there would be a shadowy figure operating behind her, and that figure would be revealed later to be Darth Maul. These paintings are no random brainstorming from the concept art team. It's George Lucas's story being illustrated very directly with the specific characters he had planned to use, probably with an eye towards being able to have visual aids to show his story in detail to Bob Iger in the meeting that was coming up. All those paintings of Luke and a Jedi Temple weren't just brainstorming either. We know that it came from Lucas that at the start of episode 7, Luke would be traumatized and semi-retired, and he was described as being like Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now. And this is reflected by all the concept art of Luke from this period being very similar and reflecting the same sort of idea of the character. The artists were obviously also given some specific directions about Luke's Jedi Temple and that planet, since all of the paintings of it show a very similar kind of place, a kind of broken down old temple in a place that looks very worn down and ancient on some kind of foggy remote island planet. One other source about Lucas's treatments that I'm going to mention are the statements from Pablo Hidalgo over the years, although I'm going to use these sparingly. Like I said earlier, his choices and what he reveals are self-serving to an extent because he chooses to reveal points where the movies that they made are similar to what Lucas initially planned, but he leaves out all the stuff that Lucas wanted that they would eventually throw away. But while Hidalgo is selective, like I said before, I don't think that he outright makes up lies. So when he said something specific about what was in the treatments, I'm mostly going to believe it unless we know something to the contrary. So in that case, relevant to where Luke was when Lucas's version of episode 7 started out, Hidalgo has said, in a very general sense, the original idea of 7 started about midway through what we now know as episode 8, meaning basically that what we eventually got in episode 8 as far as Luke being a hermit that they were trying to convince to come back, that would have been where he was at the start of the trilogy, not halfway through the trilogy. One thing that Lucas says in his description of the story from the Archives book that's a little confusing is that he says it starts out a few years after Return of the Jedi. But I think if you read what he's saying here closely, he means that Luke's Jedi school starts out a few years after Return of the Jedi, not that episode 7 starts out a few years after Return of the Jedi. Lucas has been consistent since the 80s that the third trilogy would be roughly 20 years after the second trilogy, and that there would be basically a generation each between the first and second and the second and third trilogies. Hidalgo has also said that Lucas's episode 7 took place roughly 30 years after Return of the Jedi. So at some point, a few years after Return of the Jedi, in Lucas's story, Luke started a Jedi school in which he started training new Jedi the way that the Jedi used to train them, by starting them out basically as toddlers when they're only a few years old. But by the time we see Luke at the start of episode 7, he's abandoned that plan, and for some reason, something has traumatized him and turned him into a recluse. As opposed to how the Disney movies would have it, though, Luke soon decides to come out of retirement and to train Kira, and he's back in action. And according to Lucas, by the end of the trilogy, Luke would have largely rebuilt the Jedi Order. Which brings us to the new generation of protagonists in Lucas's treatment. He planned for there to be 2 young leads, a female lead who was the main one, and her companion who would fall to the dark side. In different stages, these characters had different names, but it seems that around the time Lucas was still involved in the concept art, the girl was being referred to as Kira and the boy was being referred to as Skylar or Sam. So I'm going to go with Kira and Skylar when I talk about them. The art of The Force Awakens and the art of The Last Jedi also reveal interesting things about both of these characters from those first months when they were based on Lucas's treatment still. The art of The Force Awakens says that Skylar was the early version of the character who would eventually become Finn, but this is an oversimplification and it's not really true. In the original story, Skylar was the son of Han and Leia, and he would be seduced to the dark side by Darth Talon. From that description, you can see that they basically gave that story to Kylo Ren, which is the character Skylar turned into, more than he turned into Finn. In the second half of the video, I'll go into how and why that change happened, but for right now, we're going to try to reconstruct what was there before it was changed, rather than after it was ruined. There's a lot of concept art from those first months showing Skylar and Kira, and according to Arndt, Skylar's personality was, quote, pure charisma. Skylar was obviously meant to be in some ways a young Han Solo. So we know that in the start of the movie, he was with the good guys until he encountered encountered Talon. Hidalgo generalizes and talks about the parts involving Luke training Kira like that was the very start of the movie, but I think he means that that was where Luke started in the movie. There's a portion of the movie that happened before that which would have had Skylar and Kira together before they're separated, and before Kira then goes to Luke and convinces Luke to train her. Who exactly Kira was in Lucas's version is an interesting question, since she was ultimately to be the lead of the whole thing. She was sort of turned into Rey, but I don't think they kept a lot of Kira's actual story. Arndt describes Kira as, quote, a loner, a hothead, a gearhead, and a badass. That's his description. She sounds a lot like a young Leia to me, with maybe some bits of Anakin and Luke Skywalker thrown in there also. It hasn't been confirmed as far as I know, but I think that Kira was obviously Han and Leia's daughter, and she was Skylar's sister. Remember that Lucas has always talked about Vader having grandchildren, plural. And if you look at the early paintings of Skylar and Kira, Kira even has like Leia-esque hairstyles and white skin and brown hair, just like Skylar and Skylar's mother, Leia. And Skylar is drawn as a miniature Han Solo, basically, down to even having Han's vest sometimes. In many pieces of the early concept art from when Lucas was still involved, Skylar and Kira are on some sort of mission together at the start of the movie, and they're flying the Falcon at that point. I think the obvious reason that they would be flying the Falcon is because it's their dad's ship. To me, they obviously seem to be little miniature Han and little Leia Jr. Another thing that we get a lot of in the early paintings is the planet Felucia. And we also know that Felucia featured in Lucas's treatments. I don't think it's been revealed exactly why, but if you think about it, it does make sense. I remember when the prequels were coming out, and a lot of times there were details that weren't at all what I was expecting, but then once you thought about them, suddenly they made sense to you, and you could see a part of Lucas's thinking that you hadn't understood before, and something that you wouldn't have come up with on your own. This is the difference between having the original creator working on it and having fans and outsiders work on it and try to guess what the original creator would have done or do what they think it should be like. You can see things from a fan perspective if you're a fan, but you can't always guess what the person who actually originally made it would do if you aren't that person. You can make educated guesses if you have a good understanding, but you can't be them completely, and you don't know the things they know that they planned out but which never made it to the screen and which weren't revealed. I wouldn't have guessed that Felucia would be in Lucas's episode 7, but it's one of those things that when you think about it, it suddenly seems obvious in retrospect. Lucas was committed to each planet having a different visually distinctive environment and said that you should be able to know instantly from one shot which planet you're on. So this is necessary when you're cutting between different scenes very quickly, but it's also important to him that the environments mean something and aren't just a parade of generic places where it doesn't matter which planet the characters are on.
But I mean, that's what we got to be careful of. I mean, we got to make sure that it's very distinctive so that we can, you instantly sort of look, and I say you have to be able to look in a couple of seconds and say, okay, I know where I am, I know what that is.
So like on Naboo, we have a very craftsman and sort of elegant look, whereas on Coruscant, we have a very angular and sort of concrete and metal look. Everything about these worlds needs to be distinct enough so that when George is intercutting between these different environments in the story, you know right away where you are visually.
He did want clear and iconic shapes. Everything had to read as very distinct. The first week starting episode 3 was George wanted to see 10 planets for the war to be happening on. That's all he said, is like, the war is happening, give me 10 planets. And following George's rules, they have to be completely distinct from one another within distinct architectural style, distinct color scheme, distinctly different places.
The problem is that there are only so many different ecosystems on Earth that you can film, and by the end of the original trilogy, Lucas had already gone through most of these that could convincingly look like an alien planet, so he had to start using places that couldn't be found as locations, but which would need to be built as sets or realized as special effects.
The thing about Endor is that I wanted an environment that was different from the other environments, but it needed to be a jungly kind of place, a lot of growth and green, which is, the color of life. And I wanted to give it a different look than Dagobah, which in essence had the same qualities. It was swamp. It was, again, a cradle of life environment, lots of life there. But I was beginning to run out of environments, something that was unique. The only thing I could come up with was really giant sequoias, where the trees would be so big that it would give it a different look than what we'd seen before. And the reason I was able to move on and do the first 3 films was because I was able to create digital environments. As by the time I got down here to Return of the Jedi, I just pretty much shot everything on Earth.
even with the ability to make these new environments with special effects, there are still a limited number of different types of environments that are completely distinct before you start kind of repeating yourself or getting too similar to one another. Lucas had a list of environment ideas that he liked, some of them which he had been kicking around since his first treatments for the first movies. And when he got to Revenge of the Sith, he thought that that might be his last Star Wars movie. So most of the ones that he had left over, he used in the Order 66 sequence, quickly giving us a few shots of each of these planet ideas. When he decided to do the sequel trilogy, these planets that had made cameos during Order 66 were most of his whole list of planets that he had thought of, but which the movies hadn't used for as many scenes as other planets. So it makes sense that when he was looking for new locations, he would consider going back to some of these and expanding on them. Among these planets, Felucia was obviously one of the most visually distinctive, and you could see that there's a lot more that they could do with it. A fungus planet could have all kinds of environments and creatures that could also still fit together under a theme as distinct as a desert planet or a snow planet or swamp planet. The other consideration here is that Lucas always chose environments carefully for their symbolic value. Mustafar symbolically being hell is an obvious example. Luke growing up on a desert is another. What strikes me about using Felucia is that it looks very similar to the planet from the Clone Wars where R2 and Yoda find the Keeper of the Wills and where Qui-Gon had learned the secret of immortality. Since Lucas had said that the sequel trilogy would finally explain more about the Wills and what he termed the microbiotic world, it makes sense that he would want to return to a similar kind of environment to that planet. I don't know if anything would have been revealed about the Wills in the scenes that Lucas planned on Felucia, and I don't know the reason that Skylar and Kira went to this particular planet specifically within Lucas's story, but it seems that there could be a connection there, at least thematically. Felucia also had a sort of Alice in Wonderland look to it, with the characters looking tiny walking around among giant mushrooms and riding creatures that look like giant grubs or insects or tardigrades. This is all thematically suitable for the idea of wanting to explore how microscopic life coexists with larger creatures and all of those ideas that the Wills are about. There's a lot of interesting potential here, and it would have been very unique and new and different, so obviously it would be one of the first things that Abrams would immediately throw into the trash can because Felucia was from the prequels and he'd rather have some generic planets that all look like English countryside within a few miles of where they were shooting the movies at Pinewood Studios. But anyway, another thing we know from Hidalgo's statements is that one of the antagonists in Lucas's treatments were some kind of space pirates. Hidalgo would say this in 2018, and Lucas would say something similar 2 years later in the Archives book when he talked about how the antagonists causing problems for the rebuilding of the Republic would be underworld figures filling the power vacuum and run by Darth Maul. So you could see a group of space pirates of some kind being these underworld types of characters. If you go back to the early concept paintings for The Force Awakens, the space pirates show up there too. So you can see that this is another example of them working from Lucas's concepts when they're doing these paintings, and obviously not randomly brainstorming. Specifically, there are several concept paintings showing the Millennium Falcon on Felucia and it being raided or ambushed by space pirates of some kind. So we know that Skylar and Kira probably start off of the story on a mission together, and we know it probably involves Felucia, and we have paintings of the Falcon on Felucia, so Skylar and Kira probably took their dad's ship there for some reason, and then when they're there they get ambushed by the space pirates. It seems like they were probably either followed there by the pirates, or whatever their mission on Felucia was turned out to be a trap set for them by the pirates. We then also know that Skylar and Kira are somehow separated, and that Skylar is seduced to the dark side by Darth Talon, while Kira then goes off to Luke and convinces Luke to train her as a Jedi. Since we know it was Lucas's idea that Darth Maul was controlling the underworld and all these characters on the evil side of things, and Darth Talon was his emissary out there doing his missions for him, I'm going to assume that the pirate ambush on the Falcon was arranged by Talon and Maul for the purpose of kidnapping one or both of Han and Leia's kids, and then they took Skylar away at this point. I'm making a couple of leaps and guesses there, and I'm trying to differentiate as clearly as possible what we know for a fact and what's an educated guess. But from what we do know, I'm pretty confident in these guesses, at least generally. After Skylar is taken by Talon, we know that she then seduces him to the dark side. The concept art team even got as far as doing storyboards for a sequence of Talon seducing a Jedi character and then leaving him or possibly killing him, which could have been another purpose for having a sexy female bad guy, because she takes Han and Leia's male child and has to turn him to her side really quickly within the story. After Skylar and Kira are separated, Kira then goes to find Luke, and that brings us to the point where we find out what Luke's been up to. And this is the point when Luke would have entered the movie. So 20 or 25 years prior, Luke had been training children to be a new generation of Jedi, but something traumatic made him stop. Now, this is a pure guess about what made him stop, but based on the story elements that we know, I'm going to guess that there was some kind of raid on his Jedi school, probably by Talon and her mercenaries at the behest of Darth Maul, and some or all of the Jedi children were killed. That would explain why Luke was traumatized, and also why why he decided not to train any more Jedi, including not wanting to train Han and Leia's kids. Han and Leia's kids would obviously be Force sensitive, and they're Luke's niece and nephew, but when Episode 7 starts, they're around 20 years old, and yet Luke has never trained them as Jedi. There must be a reason for this if he was at some point training new Jedi. I think that if some or all of the children Luke was training had been killed, this would have made him think it was dangerous for people to become Jedi, and he wouldn't have wanted that for his niece and nephew. This also raises the question of how old exactly Skylar and Kira are when Lucas's version of Episode 7 starts. Pablo Hidalgo has said that they were 14, and Abrams has said that one of the things he wanted to change from Lucas's treatments were that Lucas's leads were very young, which he thought was too much like The Phantom Menace. Before either of those comments, though, Lucas had already said that the leads in his treatments were around 20 years old, and he specifically said that they weren't similar to Anakin in The Phantom Menace. He probably knew that that similarity would have been a contention, and he was pointing this out to say that he wasn't repeating the idea of having a very young child lead.
And that the children were in their 20s and everything, so it wasn't Phantom Menace again.
It seems obvious that Lucas brings up this point in this interview when talking about how they changed his stories, because he said over the years that if a studio had had control over The Phantom Menace, they wouldn't have let him make Anakin 9 years old. And it seems like they brought this issue up to him as an issue with his sequel trilogy treatments, that they didn't want more young lead characters. And he was annoyed by this complaint because, as he says, these characters weren't as young as Anakin. They were in their early 20s. Luke and Leia in A New Hope were supposed to be around 18 years old. So the idea of this being a problem of characters in their late teens, early 20s was of course silly, and it's just paranoia about doing anything that fans had whined about in the prequels, even if it was something that had already been done in the original trilogy. Abrams making an issue out of the ages of the protagonist was just purely giving in to fan backlash. And besides all that, as Lucas has said many times, the Star Wars movies are designed for 12-year-olds, and they're coming-of-age stories about young people going out into the world on their own for the first time. So you'd want characters that aren't necessarily 12, but characters that a 12-year-old audience could identify with and aspire toward, and who were just discovering how to be adults. Instead, we end up with Rey and Kylo seemingly being vaguely in their late 20s or early 30s or something, for some reason, even though that doesn't make much sense for any of their stories, purely because Disney wanted to pander to middle-aged whining fanboys instead of the people that Star Wars is actually meant to be for.
It's a kids' movie. It's always been a kids' movie. It is a kids' movie.
Hello, George Lucas. Why did you create Star Wars?
I did it because I wanted to make a film for young people, and I wanted to make a film that was an exciting story that had values and dealt with issues that young people confront.
In the real world, you know, the critics, certain fans and things, you know, they're not very kind. But when you see all these little kids and you see the look on their face and what it means to them, it forgives everything.
Well, you know.
But as far as figuring out what was in Lucas's treatments before Disney changed them, the point is that in those treatments, Skylar and Kira were meant to be young adults, late teens or early 20s. Since Lucas has confirmed specific ages for them, I'm going to assume that the comments from Hidalgo and Abrams making them sound very young or 14 years old are exaggerations to explain why they wanted to change the characters, and I'm going to take Lucas's word here that they were meant to be closer to 20 years old. Either way, changing their ages and family relationships to the Skywalkers is a mistake that would undermine everything about the Disney sequel trilogy. The age of these characters and the fact that they were Darth Vader's grandchildren is a core issue not only with this movie, but with Lucas's entire concept of all 9 movies being a generational soap opera. It's an absolutely necessary component.
Well, it's a film about families. Yeah. It's a film about generations and what one generation leaves behind that the next generation has to deal with.
To me, these next movies are about the next generation, as the prequels were about a new generation, and the originals were for that generation. I mean, again, I think it would be awesome. Like, who doesn't want to see Han Solo cruise through on the Falcon again? But at the same time, maybe he's teaching his son how to drive on it. I don't know.
Back to why I started talking about the ages of Skylar and Kira. The fact that they were in their late teens or early 20s raises the issue of Luke not training his own niece and nephew when they're now adults or nearly adults, and why during the course of the movie he would then decide to change his mind and train Kira after all. We can assume that Luke hadn't wanted to train them because of what had happened with the other children in his Jedi school, but that they were both Force sensitive and presumably very powerful, which would be why Talon would have wanted Skylar or maybe both of them. After Talon has taken Skylar, she soon seduces him to the dark side. So my personal theory here is that Luke realizes that by not training them himself, he's left them open to being trained by somebody else and thus trained in the wrong way. Kira wants to be trained to fight Talon and presumably to save Skylar, and Luke decides that it's better if he does it and rather than let somebody else do it. We know more about how Lucas's story treatment started than how they ended. So here I'm going to get into some more speculation again, but I think that it's interesting that Lucas specifically says that when Luke started his Jedi school, he was training the children starting at ages 2 or 3 the way the Jedi did it in the days before the Empire. But then Luke goes on to not only train Kira when she's in her early 20s, but also train Leia when she's in her 60s. This makes me think of Lucas's comments about the third trilogy being about the characters dealing with the consequences of their family history and moral choices about passing on what you've learned to the next generation.
Well, it's a film about families. Yeah. It's a film about generations and what one generation leaves behind that the next generation has to deal with.
Something obviously changed in Luke's outlook from when he was training 3-year-olds to being willing to train adults. And while he would still ultimately rebuild the Jedi Order, he decided to break with some of their old traditions. My personal theory relates to the fact that in the prequels, while the Jedi had good intentions, Lucas also was trying to show that they had made some mistakes, obviously. Chief among these mistakes being too sure of themselves and not questioning their own traditions.
Too sure of themselves they are. Even the older, more experienced ones. Your arrogance blinds you.
It's a theme that Lucas returns to several times. While the Jedi becoming too complacent and too sure of themselves is what eventually leads to their downfall, Palpatine's downfall happens when he becomes too sure of his own power and does the same thing in his own version.
Your overconfidence is your weakness.
I think that while the Jedi had good intentions with their philosophy of forbidding personal attachment and romance, it was setting an ideal that was ultimately impossible in some ways, and the fact that Anakin couldn't live up to this ideal would eventually be his downfall. This idea is the reason that the Jedi would take children so young to prevent them from having these personal attachments. But while that might keep them from having those attachments, it would also keep them from experiencing fundamental parts of relationships with other people. And it would be why they didn't understand what was happening with Anakin and why they couldn't understand the Sith, who are all about passion. And the failure to understand those things is how their order eventually would be destroyed. How I think that this would relate to Lucas's plans for the sequel trilogy is that when Luke sees what happens to Skylar without guidance, Luke would question whether it was wrong to train Kira or whether he should do it after all, even though the Jedi would have considered her too old. He would have remembered when he was her age, and Yoda also thought that he was too old. He would have rethought the whole idea of it being necessary to train Jedi from such a young age. And in rethinking that idea, he would have had to consider that maybe it would be all right to train somebody who already had the kind of connections and interpersonal relationships that the older generations of Jedi would have considered a flaw. He would have to see how those relationships could be part of a Jedi's life and could be included. And to return to Lucas's theme of learning from the past and passing on what they've learned, I think the insight Luke could have learned here is that maybe Anakin's fatal flaw wasn't that he had these emotional attachments, but rather that the way the Jedi were trained back then didn't give him any tools to properly deal with those attachments.
Train yourself to let go of everything you fear to lose.
While it might have been practical, I always thought that Yoda's advice to Anakin that he should just let it go when he's afraid that a loved one will die was very cold, and I think Lucas meant it to sound that way.
What happens when you go to the dark side is it goes out of balance, and then you get really selfish and you forget about everybody, and you ultimately lead yourself, because when you get selfish, you get stuff. Or you want stuff. And when you want stuff and you get stuff, then you are afraid somebody's going to take it away from you. Whether it's a person or a thing or a particular pleasure, experience. Once you become afraid that somebody's going to take it away from you, or you're going to lose it, then you start to become angry. Especially if you're losing it.
Fear leads to anger.
And that anger leads to hate.
Anger leads to hate.
And hate leads to suffering.
Hate leads to suffering.
Mostly on the part of the person who's selfish, because you spend all your time being afraid of losing everything you've got, instead of actually living. Where joy, by giving to other people, you can't think about yourself, and therefore there's no pain. But the pleasure factor of greed and of selfishness is a short-lived experience. Therefore, you're constantly trying to replenish it. But of course, the more you replenish it, the harder it is to, so you have to keep upping the ante. You're actually
afraid of the pain of not having the joy. So that is ultimately the core of the whole dark side, light side of the Force. And everything flows from that. Obviously, the Sith are always unhappy because they never get enough of anything they want. Mostly their selfishness centers around power and control. And the struggle is always to be able to let go of all that stuff. And of course, that's the problem with Anakin ultimately is you're allowed to love people, but you're not allowed to possess them. And what he did is that he, fell in love and then married her and then became jealous. And then he saw in his visions that she was going to die. He couldn't stand losing her. So in order to not lose her, he made a pact with the devil to be able to become all-powerful.
Lucas agreed that attachment and greed were a path to the dark side, but we still have emotions that we can't just will away. That's what gives Anakin's eventual fall to the dark side an understandable motivation, even if it would eventually lead him to inexcusable actions.
I wish that I could just wish away my feelings, but I can't.
I think the idea that the Jedi in the prequels thought you could just decide to ignore your emotions was meant to be seen as a flaw in their philosophy. The Jedi wanted to teach their pupils never to have these emotional attachments in the first place, so they didn't really teach them how to lose somebody when they did have an attachment like that, which is why Anakin thought the idea of losing somebody was just inconceivable. He had no tools for dealing with it, and he still had a child's conception of loss as being an impossible or unknowable thing. But while his attachments to his mother and Padme led him to take his first steps to the dark side when he couldn't deal with losing them, in the end it would also be an emotional attachment, his attachment to his children, that would save him. Lucas has said many times that what redeemed Anakin was his children, and just like his attachment to Padme, children, even though they would be Anakin's saving grace, were an attachment that Jedi weren't supposed to have. So in Lucas's sequel trilogy, by training Kira when she's older, Luke could be realizing that the Jedi were wrong about her attachments being a flaw, and he could see that her attachment to her brother and her concern for another person could actually be what motivates her to become a great Jedi. Combine this with the fact that Luke would go on to train Leia, who I think was Kira's mother, and while the Jedi in the prequel saw Anakin's attachment to his mother as a weakness and a flaw, here in the sequel trilogy, we could have actually had a mother-daughter Jedi team. Lucas has also said that he wanted the sequel trilogy to have a focus on Leia and a focus on Vader's granddaughter, and that in a way Leia would ultimately be the chosen one. So in that way, Leia and Kira both becoming Jedi as Luke rebuilds Jedi Order would ultimately show the Jedi Order healing from their past mistakes and passing on the lessons that they've learned, like Lucas has always said that the sequel trilogy was meant to show. Or, anyway, that's just my theory, but from the few facts that we have, it seems like the plot events I'm describing were all definitely there. The parts that are just a theory are mostly my ideas about what those events would have meant thematically and why Lucas would have wanted to explore them. It seems like a very interesting and very rich vein of ideas for the sequel trilogy to explore. But, of course, instead we could just get Rey being related to Palpatine for no reason at all, and then lighting up a yellow lightsaber for no reason at all, and then calling herself a Skywalker for no reason at all. And I guess that's what the people getting paid the big bucks to make these movies decided would be just as good as Lucas's ideas, so what the hell do I know? Anyway, as to Lucas's comments that one of the focuses of this trilogy would be on Leia and that she would be in some ways the chosen one, I think this is another comment from him that gets largely misunderstood. Some fans took umbrage at this, seeing it as some kind of retcon that would remove the accomplishments of Anakin or Luke, depending on which of them you consider to be the chosen one from the prophecy that's discussed in The Phantom Menace. But the fact that there are already at least two people that you can make arguments for being the chosen one who fulfilled the prophecy kind of illustrates the real point of what Lucas was saying here. The prophecy has always been open to interpretation, and how you read it depends on your own point of view.
A prophecy that misread could have been.
The suffering of your people will persuade you to see our point of view.
From your point of view?
Good as a point of view, Anakin.
From my point of view, the Jedi are evil!
So what I told you was true, from a certain point of view.
A certain point of view?
Luke, you're going to find that many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view.
If you just watched the first trilogy, it's likely you would say that Luke was the protagonist of the whole thing because he has the hero's journey and the personal battle at the end of the story and all of that. If you just watch the prequels first and then the original trilogy, you could see the argument that it's all Anakin's story. When you're watching the first couple movies, Anakin's definitely the hero. But Lucas has also said several times in the past that structurally A New Hope is actually all Leia's story. If you think about the movie in terms of plot, it's Leia's fight as a leader in the rebellion that's at stake. Luke wanders into that fight late and he starts fighting alongside them, but it wasn't Luke's fight. He just came to it by happenstance. At the start of the story, Luke wanted to go join the Imperial Academy.
I tell you, Luke, the rebellion's a long way from here.
I made some friends at the Academy. When our frigate leaves for one of the central systems, we're gonna jump ship and join the Alliance.
The rebellion?
Leia's the one who's struggling to recruit Obi-Wan and who's trying to get the Death Star plans back to Yavin 4. Luke doesn't even know that any of these things are an issue or that this stuff's going on. Leia's the one that's trying to escape the Death Star, and Luke just ends up there because he wandered into a tractor beam. Leia's the one that the Empire is trying to get information from. It's her planet that they blow up. The Empire is very concerned with Leia, and they're not in a fight against Luke. They don't even know that Luke's around.
They said, there's no women in the movies. I said, who do you think the heroes are in those films? What do you think Princess Leia was? She is the head of the rebellion. She's the one that's taking this young kid that doesn't know anything and this boisterous, I know everything guy who can't do anything and trying to save the rebellion with these clowns. I said, she's the hero of the movie. And it's the same thing with Queen Amidala. Even though she has Jedi on her side, she was still the hero prime mover.
The thing about Princess Leia is that she's the smartest person in the room. She's the one that rescued the guys. The guys didn't rescue her.
This is something that Lucas has always liked playing with, the idea of perspective and point of view and whose story it really is, and going against expectations and all of that. He does the same thing in The Phantom Menace with the story starting out by following the Jedi Knights like A New Hope started out following the droids, but then finding Anakin and Anakin having the call to adventure like Luke did in A New Hope, which in a Joseph Campbell hero's journey would make Anakin the protagonist. But again, Anakin is mostly along for the ride in The Phantom Menace, just like with Leia in A New Hope, and Luke being basically along for the ride in that movie. And if you look at The Phantom Menace structurally, the story is actually Padme's story. Structurally, The Phantom Menace is all about what Padme's trying to accomplish and the mission she's on. The boys are along for the ride in a kind of incidental way. This is an exact parallel to A New Hope structurally, but all the particulars are changed so that it's not a remake of the same movie. A lot of people don't even notice these structural parallels that I'm pointing out, unlike, say, in The Force Awakens, where everybody saw it. Even the people who liked The Force Awakens could see that it was just a remake of A New Hope. This is the difference between doing a new riff on a similar idea or a new story with a similar structure, doing a theme and a variation like in music or in poetry. It's the difference between that and then just making the same movie again, like in, say a J.J. Abrams movie. But we're going to talk more about that later. The point is that just like the prophecy about the Chosen One could have had multiple interpretations, there can be more than one way to view who's the hero of the saga. Lucas wanted each new episode to add new layers of meaning to the ones that had come before, so it's predictable and necessary even that Lucas's idea for the third trilogy would have added a new perspective on what the overall story of the series was all about the whole time from the beginning. You would view episodes 1 through 6 differently after you viewed his episodes 7 through 9. That doesn't negate the other perspectives.
Anakin is the Chosen One, and even when Anakin turns into Darth Vader, he is still the Chosen One.
Lucas has said that when you watch the 6 movies, Anakin is the Chosen One. However, there are also story notes from back when he was working on Empire Strikes Back, where he clearly specifically says that Luke is the Chosen One. This is interesting for several reasons. The first being because the Chosen One idea was another idea from the prequels that fans didn't like because it didn't fit with how they thought about the original trilogy. But this shows that Lucas had that exact concept in place all the way back at the beginning, at least 20 years before it was actually mentioned in the movies. And it's also interesting because it shows that while Lucas said that when you watch 6 episodes, the Chosen One is Anakin, he's also said that during the original trilogy, the Chosen One is Luke, and during his plans for the sequel trilogy, it's Leia. I think that Lucas sees this like the Kuleshov effect, only on a macro scale instead of a micro scale. This is a fundamental thing to how he thinks about movies and storytelling. Like I talk about in the first video on this series, the Kuleshov effect is a film theory concept about how multiple sequential shots create new meaning by how the shots are edited together. The classic example being a man with a neutral expression being edited together with different other shots. If the second shot added is a bowl of soup, people interpret the neutral expression on the man's face as being hunger. But if the second shot is an image of a dead child, people interpret the same expression on his face as being sorrow, and so on. You can do infinite variations. This is a fundamental concept about how movies can create meanings by combining images, and it's an important part of how Lucas thinks about movies. You create the meaning by how the images are edited together, rather than just by individual images. The sum of the images means more than the individual images on their own, and it grows exponentially as the total number of images grows larger. So you can create more and more layers of meanings and communicate more and more complicated ideas as the series goes on. Doing this by editing together two shots is an example of doing it on what I was calling the micro scale. I think what was really interesting to Lucas and what kept Star Wars interesting for him and motivated him to create new episodes was that he could also do this on a macro scale. For example, if you can imagine watching A New Hope by itself when it was the only Star Wars movie that had been released, that story is going to have one set of meanings. But then when you add Empire Strikes Back and you know more about the Force and you hear the twist on who Luke's father is, suddenly A New Hope is a different movie. And then you add Return of the Jedi and you learn who Luke's sister is, and suddenly the first two movies are different movies all over again. And then you add the prequels and you learn about Anakin's backstory and you understand who's under Darth Vader's mask, and suddenly the original three movies are different movies all over yet again. You can keep doing this. I think this is part of why many fans, starting with some fans way back in 1983 with the release of Return of the Jedi, and even a few fans in 1980 with the release of Empire Strikes Back, have always had such a hostile reaction to Lucas's expansions of Star Wars. It's not just that they didn't like the new movie, but it's that they really didn't like what the revelations in the new movie did to their perceptions of the old movies. Eventually, though, the new information becomes part of the zeitgeist, and it's not a surprise to people anymore, so it's not a shock to the system the way it was when the movies first came out, and they start to accept it more. This is a completely different phenomenon in many ways to why people didn't like the Disney Star Wars trilogy, and it's why when people say that eventually the sequel trilogy will be reevaluated like the prequel trilogy was, they're wrong, because the reason for the negativity towards these movies is fundamentally different. But in Lucas's plans for the sequel trilogy, I think the reaction to his ideas for Leia probably would have been similar to some of the revelations in the prequels about Anakin. He would have had Luke die in episode 8 or thereabouts, and the ones to resolve the story and finally restore the Republic and see the fulfillment of Luke's Jedi school would have been Leia and her daughter, assuming that Kira was her daughter, which I think we can. But this wouldn't negate anything that Luke accomplished, because they wouldn't have brought back a cloned emperor negating Anakin's sacrifice to save Luke, and they wouldn't have brought back the Empire just renamed as the First Order as though nothing the characters in the original trilogy had done had mattered. And Luke wouldn't have been a little bitch who just sat on an island until his last days, never trying to fix what had gone wrong after Return of the Jedi. Leia and Kira would be the ones to see the story through to the end, because Luke would have died before the very end, but Luke would have still trained both of them, and they would both be carrying on his legacy in that way. He would have accomplished something by learning from his mistakes and passing on what he had learned. The entire Jedi Order would ultimately be restored, and this would have been part of Luke's legacy. Hopefully, it would be restored in an improved version that had also adopted what Luke had learned about the mistakes of the old version, and it would be ready to stand up again for generations like the old Jedi Order had done during its glory days. Luke would be dead, and you could argue about whether Luke or Anakin or Leia had really been the chosen one who restored balance to the Force, but there would all three be important characters still who did something in the story that mattered and had a lasting impact and a lasting legacy. Speaking of more comments that always get misunderstood, one more thing to go into is that we also have Lucas's comments talking about how his sequel trilogy would have finally explained the wills and got into what he termed the microbiotic world.
I'm not sure I can do that. That was where the original Star Wars saga came from. It was a larger work that I had been working on that Star Wars was just a piece of.
I don't know. It's hard to say what fans take away, from the films, and sometimes they see the films very differently than you do. So it's, I learned that when I added 7 frames to show the hand didn't just shoot somebody in cold blood.
Now, I've already done the whole other video in this series talking about the wills and explaining what they are and what they mean to the story, so I'm not going to repeat all of that here. If you're still fuzzy on that, go find the playlist I have on my channel and watch that video. I think it's something a lot of people are fuzzy on because, like Lucas has said, it's something he never got to explain completely within the movies themselves, but it is something that's extremely important to his conception of the Force and his conception of all of Star Wars, both on a plot structure level with R2 narrating the story to the Keeper of the Wills, and also on a thematic level as far as what the Force means and what all that says about the story he's telling. As far as Lucas's plans for the sequel trilogy, though, it's a relevant issue because he said that his sequel trilogy would finally have explained the wills more in the movies. That's when he said that the movies would get into the microbiotic world, which people immediately misinterpreted as him saying that the characters would shrink down and travel around like microbes like in the Magic School Bus. But that's not something he ever actually said would happen. He just said that they would get into the issue of the wills and get into the issue of the microbiotic world, meaning that they'd explain it and they'd deal with the concept. This is another issue where I think giving this context would have retroactively given new layers of meaning to the previous episodes in the Kuleshov effect way in which Lucas likes to operate. You would have been able to go back to those episodes and suddenly see all the other meanings that were there, and you suddenly wouldn't need me to make a YouTube video to explain all this to you because now all the relevant pieces would actually be in the movies. You wouldn't have to research or, read interviews with Lucas to find them. This is what he was interested in doing in all of his Star Wars sequels and prequels, building out the story and the world in a way that would give more depth to the whole enterprise and bring in something new that you wouldn't have had without the new episodes, as opposed to, just repeating what he'd already done. But if we're going to start talking about just making meaningless repetitions of what's already been done, I think that finally brings us up nicely to the start of the Disney era of Star Wars, and it's time to finally start talking about, rather than what Lucas had planned, what we would actually end up getting instead.
What a piece of junk! Piece of junk!
My grandfather died fighting a vampire. Oh no, there was nothing ludicrous about it. He was a scientist. His evidence was conclusive. There is evil in this world. There are dark, awful things. Occasionally we get a glimpse of them. But there are dark corners and horrors almost impossible to imagine. Even in our worst nightmares. There is a Satan.
Thank you for joining us, and of course, may the Force be with you.